Ro, nā wa whakatere tani wā, nā mana, nā reo, koutou e noho mai nei i raro i te tāwharau pana o tō tātou na whare, e noho nei ki te manaaki a tātou i tēnei ahi ahi. O reira tēnei te mihi ake. Tēnei te mihi ake kia koutou. I haere mai te tī, i haere mai te tā, koutou i haere mai tapiti, i haere mai tata. Tēnei te reo whakatau. Aotearoa Waka, ia koutou i tēnei ahi ahi. Kei te kāhui o te maunga tīpō hea. Koutou o Ngāti Rangi nui, Ngāti Rua nui, wa tau mai nei ki waina nui a mātou. Tēnei te mihi ake. E mihi ake ana i nei te āhuatanga. I runa nō hoki i nā kōrero o koutou ko tāu mai. Ki te Herenga Waka, Herenga Tanata, Herenga Whetū, ko koutou tēnei, te ope o te rua matariki, ko tāu mai. O reira, haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. Tātou te whānau, tēnei, ka whakairi ake i nā kōrero, ki nā pakitara o tō tātena whare. Ki te tuanui o tō tātena whare, waiho mo te tau tītoki, tiki nā tua, tiki nā noai, i au a kōrero rā, o reira, puri noa, te nā koutou, a piti hono tātai hono, nā mate, kia rātau, a piti hono tātai hono, tātau, e noho nei ki te mata o te whenua kia tātau, tēnā tātau katoa. Kia ora. Aku piki ko tuku e, rere tātahi ana e, hoki mai anō ki te awhi ahau, aku tau piki ko tuku e. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Anna Gold. I'm the head of school for the School of Geography, Environment and Earth Sciences. On behalf of the school, the faculty at the university, I'm welcoming all of you here in the room and online, and especially the delegation from Ngāti Ranui here today to our symposium on environmental, social, and economic implications of critical mineral mining in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's especially meaningful to host this conversation as part of our 30th anniversary of development studies in our school. I'm looking forward to the diversity of perspectives that we'll hear today from the lineup of speakers. And it's really my hope that we'll be walking away today here with a more informed perspective and some new insights. Global demand on critical mineral is accelerating, driven by energy transition, new technologies, and the AI revolution. And we are all part of this cycle. So here we are asking today, what does the global race for critical minerals mean for New Zealand? What are the impacts of mining on our landscape, communities, economies, and the treaty obligations? This symposium is intended to facilitate an informed and open conversation. There are so many perspectives to consider, ranging from economic opportunities, environmental responsibilities, treaty obligations, intergenerational equity, and geopolitical considerations. These do not always align and often are in conflict with each other. So we're here today to bring together different insights and explore the complexities of these competing interests and values. In the School of Geography, Environment and Earth Sciences, we research and teach about people, places, and our planet, and focus on topics that cut across environmental justice and sustainability, geology, and earth sciences. That diversity of thought is a strength that we bring, and it allows us to host this kind of conversations that we're having here today around complex issues like critical mining in New Zealand. Conversations like this are also part of our degree programs, like the Bachelors of Environment and Society. Today, we are committed to creating a safe and a space for safe, civil, and thought-provoking dialogue, especially on an issue that is challenging and does not have any simple answers. I encourage you all to engage openly, listen carefully, and challenge constructively, no matter where your heart is on this topic. Finally, my sincere thanks to the speakers and panelists that we have here today that are going to share their perspectives and expertise, to the organizers, Caroline Bolton and Valentine Ibeka, and our moderator, Glenn Banks, that really made the symposium possible. With all of this, I'm looking forward to a stimulating and productive afternoon in Aotearoa.
Right. On behalf of the organizers of this symposium, I joined the head of school to welcome you all to this event. Some housekeeping: in case of emergency, use the nearest exit doors. We've got two behind. If you need to use the restroom, we've got restroom downstairs, so you can see a staircase, stairways, and then you can go downstairs. If it's an earthquake, act quickly. Drop to the ground, get under cover, and hold until the shaking stops. If there is no cover, crouch on your knees on the floor away from windows, put your arms over your head and neck to protect them. If you cannot get to the floor, cover your head and neck as best as you can. Lock your wheels if you're in a wheelchair. The focus of our symposium, Mining Critical Minerals, is not only topical, but quite sensitive. We recognize that there are strongly held opinions and views on the socio-environmental issues such as mining. And while we acknowledge the diversity of views that exist in relation to this topic, we recognize that these views can be opposing and sometimes irreconcilable, actually irreconcilable. But our aim is to bring some of these irreconcilable views into conversation. And indeed, one of the roles of the university is to provide a venue for this sort of critical conversations. So the symposium, as intended, is to offer us an opportunity for a more informed national discussion about critical minerals. Thus, it's important that we give to all our speakers equal and respectful attention, even if we strongly disagree with their views on this topic. So would request that we don't interrupt our speakers, no air horning, no raising of banners. We engage in the symposium civilly. As you find on the program leaflet, we have 4 speakers. The 4 speakers we present. Thereafter, we have a 30 minutes afternoon tea. We'll have it in the lounge here. If the weather is good, another Wellington day, we can stay inside. But if Wellington is favorable, we can stay outside. We've decided to keep all questions and comments to the end of the program during the panel session section. So you can use the Mentimeter, which show the QR code on the slides to ask your questions. So those are some of the housekeeping rules, and we look forward to an engaging conversation today. On that, I would invite our first speaker, Matthew from GNS, to take the podium.
Well, thank you for having me here today. I'm going to try and charge through probably a semester's worth of material in 30 minutes. And I'm going to look at New Zealand's occurrence of critical minerals, so where they are, how they got there, so how they form geologically, and also how we explore for them. So first up, what is a critical mineral? Well, the New Zealand government, or the consultants that prepared the critical mineral list, give us that definition. But if we just pull some key things out of that, they're minerals that are essential to our economy and security. They're essential for our technology needs, and also they're susceptible possibly to supply disruptions either domestically or internationally. Another simpler way to look at it is from our Critical Minerals for Kiwi Kids website, where we say they're very special things found in the earth. And they're critical because they're essential for us in our modern day lives, but they're not easy to find. And they're really important for making things for our clean energy future. So they're really important for our cell phones, our cars, our rail networks, our health system. Anything we're creating these days, it's probably got a critical mineral in it somewhere. So the New Zealand government released its first critical minerals list last year, and the study by Wood Mackenzie, they identified 35 minerals that were critical to New Zealand based on a variety of factors. You can read that in their report. And the government added on gold and metallurgical coal later for economic reasons. Of those, we have occurrences for 22 of those minerals and elements in New Zealand, and apparently we produce only 10 of them. And like in other countries around the world, the list is intended to be updated through time. So as our technology needs change or as society changes, we need to update this list with what is actually critical to New Zealand. So where can we find critical minerals? Well, essentially the minerals, they come from rock out of the ground. And almost all of New Zealand has the opportunity to host a critical mineral of some sort. They're found in our rocks and sediments, both onshore and offshore. And if we think, right, here they are, for example, gold and tungsten and copper and antimony through our schist belt through the South Island. They occur in our intrusive deposits throughout the South Island and up in some places of the North Island. We get critical minerals out of our volcanic rocks in the central and northern North Island. Our coastal and river gravels are full of minerals that contain critical minerals as well, offshore and in the seabed. And if you include aggregate, which is also a critical mineral, that takes up a lot of the rest of the country. So you can almost go anywhere in anyone's backyard, dig up a whole lot of rock and find some gold. The problem is the amount of gold that's in there is tiny, and the amount of money and time you need to process that fleck out, it's not economic. So what we're looking for, and our big challenge, is working out where these minerals and metals have concentrated to make their extraction economic. And the process of finding that is called mineral exploration. So we know about thousands of mineral occurrences in our country about where these critical minerals have been found in the past by explorers and researchers. And you can have a look on a web map that we have from our Geological Resources Map of New Zealand database for where some of these critical minerals occur. And an occurrence, and that's a key word there, occurrence is where there's evidence that mineralization exists, where it's been physically observed or a chemical analysis tells us there is a concentration of that mineral there. What they aren't, though, is a map of deposits or a resource where it's economic enough to mine that material out. It's not a treasure map to go and dig here. Okay? And that's the big difference. If we look historically and compare that, let's go back one image there. If we compare that map of occurrences with the same map of where we've had historic production, it is far fewer areas where we've had production. In fact, over half of those are actually for alluvial and placer gold. So compared to the occurrences, there's not actually been that much historical production in New Zealand. Each deposit is actually quite unique, like every person is unique, but we can group them in ways that help us describe the general genesis and geological environment they formed in. And one way to do this is a system called mineral systems. So it allows us to group them together. And effectively, it's a framework that explains how and where the mineral deposits formed. So it considers things like, where was the energy that got the fluids and the metals moving? Where was the metals and elements? What were they hosted in that the fluids need to pass through and pick them up? How were they concentrated through structures and shear zones and other features to then move them to a place where the metals would be trapped in the rock, either physical or chemical trap of some sort? And also, what are the features that we see on the surface or when we're getting near a deposit that allow an exploration geologist to narrow in on where that deposit it is? And you need all of these features pretty much to line up in both space and time to have a good probability of a deposit occurring. If you miss one of them and the fluids just trickle off into no man's land, then the deposit is gone. If you don't have that energy or you don't have a source of metals to start with, the fluids will move through and not collect anything and not be able to deposit it. And the other thing to bear in mind is we may talk about a gold deposit or an antimony deposit, but actually a lot of these deposits host a whole lot of different minerals all in one. We may have historically mined gold, but there's probably tungsten and antimony and copper in there as well, but it just wasn't extracted out historically. So we can group all of the mineral systems, there's probably a dozen of them or so in New Zealand, into four main groups: magmatic, hydrothermal, metamorphic, and sedimentary. So if we think about the magmatic ones to start with, in the northwestern corner of the South Island there, these are related to igneous intrusions. So intrusions that have come through deep in the crust, and these deposits, they're highly variable and they're really dependent. They have a lot of different deposit types and a lot of different critical minerals coming out. And it depends on how deep the intrusion was placed, how evolved the magma was, what its source was, and how it interacted with all the different rock types as they came through. And, you know, these mineral systems, they can be granite related for a whole lot of minerals there. We can have different dikes and intrusions that are rich in rare earth elements or lithium, and even ultramafic rocks for some of our base metals mineralization. So a lot of different critical minerals are associated with this particular type. Our next type, hydrothermal, these are related to our near-surface volcanic activity. It's also known as the epithermal system. So volcanic intrusions come through at a high level, and the fluids they produce with them as the magma comes through, they concentrate their minerals into veins and volcanic rocks in the adjacent sediments. So a modern analog is the Champagne Pool. Is precipitating these minerals out of the fluids, but what we see these days for those when we're exploring for them is a bit more like that vein shown on the Massey Reef there. It's a lump of quartz that's had metals come out with it as it's cooled, and the chemistry has changed and the metals have dropped out. So the main regions for that is up in the Northland, Coromandel, Taupo volcanic zone, and also offshore through the Kermadec Ridge. Our third type, metamorphic, is through the Otago schist belt and up in northwest Nelson and Marlborough. And these are critical minerals that form during folding and faulting and metamorphism, so changes of the rock due to tectonics. It's also known as the orogenic system. So the metals, they're sourced from either sandstone or some sort of deep intrusion. We're not quite sure what's under Otago exactly. And then they're transported during the metamorphic process that creates fluids through the rock, and they're concentrated into some sort of structural trap or some trap or a chemical trap that forces those metals to drop out of the fluids at some time. And these are our classic big gold deposits in Otago, like Macraes and the Rise and Shine deposit as well. So you're talking your gold and your tungsten, copper, and antimony in these. Our fourth group, sedimentary. So these are our placer and alluvial deposits. They're really large comparatively, and they occur in our river gravels, coastal sands, and our seabed sediments. And these are the metals and minerals that are eroded from the mountains. The natural process of the rivers, they sort the heavy minerals out. So we're talking things like gold and ilmenite and garnet and rare earth element bearing minerals are concentrated in those gravels. And they mainly occur along our western coastline, but also in rivers adjacent to anywhere where there's hard rock deposits, because you can imagine those metals falling out and being eroded down into the sediments. And historically, the gold actually, these alluvial and placer deposits account for almost all of our mined gold, or a very large amount of it in New Zealand. We also need to remember that we have a massive offshore environment too. Our EEZ and ECS covers about 5.7 million kilometres offshore, and it's largely unexplored. So there's a lot of potential for critical minerals offshore. So we have phosphate occurring on the Chatham Rise as nodules, ferromanganese nodules as well in the Southern Ocean. Our placer deposits that I was just talking about actually get washed out to sea, as well as being along our beaches and in our rivers. And we have a lot of iron sand as well off our western shoreline of the North Island. Although iron itself isn't a critical mineral, the vanadium and titanium that's associated with it is on the critical mineral list. And we also have hydrothermal minerals in the active volcanic arc along the Kermadec Ridge. We have these hydrothermal vents that are very, very rich in minerals, but they're a long way below the surface, so a real challenge to get to. And that's the big thing with our offshore deposits and seabed deposits, is they're really challenging to explore. But our technology is getting better, and it's allowing us to safely access these areas to study them and learn more about them. Aggregate. Aggregate is a critical mineral. Arguably, I'd say it's our most critical of the critical minerals. Okay, so aggregate is our crushed stone and sand and gravel. It's used in our construction of our roads, our buildings, and our concrete. They are bulky and they're low value, so we can't fly them in on a jet from Sydney. Okay, we have to produce them nearby, and we have to produce them nearby where people are using them, because we don't want these big trucks having to travel long distances. It's not economic and it's not good for our roads. So we need our quarries in a bit of a Goldilocks zone, really. You don't want to be too close to where people are, but you don't want to be too far away and have it too expensive either. We consume 45 to 60 million tonnes of aggregate a year. So that's about 9 tonnes per person. So for each of us in the room, that's one of those trucks each of aggregate per capita. Okay, so that's a lot of aggregate material that we're consuming every year. So how do we explore for these critical minerals in New Zealand? Well, exploration, it's essentially an exercise in error reduction. You start with all of New Zealand and you're trying to narrow in to where, like I was saying at the start, where are these metals concentrated for us to find? And geologists are the detectives looking for clues about the processes that can lead us to where these minerals are deposited. And the modern day explorers are armed with huge amounts of data, and we stand on the shoulders of all those experienced people who have explored before us. And exploration, it occurs in a series of steps, and I'm going to run through these steps in a minute. But from a desktop study, where we're just looking at information to try and target in where we should perhaps go and explore and look for these critical minerals, through to actually boots on the ground, going out and prospecting and exploring and trying to understand the value of the deposit. And it's really challenging, and it demands a lot of expertise and a wide range of specialists. So not just geologists or geophysicists, but also archaeologists, data scientists, all the way through to social scientists and even lawyers. Okay, so it's a huge range of scientists and specialists that help with the exploration process. So we can think of the exploration process as moving through these steps. We start with thousands, maybe tens of thousands of targets generated through some sort of area selection through our desktop study. And then we'll go and we'll prospect for those. So that's the boots on the ground process. We're going to go, it's fairly low impact. We're going to have a look around, confirm our targeting. Then we're going to move to an exploration phase, a bit more intensive, and advanced exploration appraisal after that. And that's sort of when we'll define a deposit and define that it's economic. Then we need to work through feasibility, consenting, and then at the very end is the mining phase. And the odds of moving, and you can see those numbers in white underneath there, from thousands of targets that we select, maybe only one will become a mine. Okay, so the odds are actually relatively low of moving through, but the science is getting better and better and trying to reduce those odds down. It's also really time consuming. You can spend a year generating some targets, but you're going to spend maybe 4 years prospecting, having a look around, up to 18 years for an exploration permit in New Zealand. And by that time, you should have defined your resource or moved to somewhere else. And then maybe 5 to 15, 20 years for your feasibility and consenting. So let's say 35 years all up, optimistically perhaps. It's expensive too. We're talking millions and millions of dollars through the exploration phase, and even more for your feasibility and consenting. So you're spending all that money, and it's not till right to the end, if you do find a deposit and you're able to mine it out, that you generate any funds back from all that process. And a lot can change. If you think about a 35-year process that I just described there, let's look at how some of the commodity changes how some of the commodity prices have changed in that 35-year process. If we were looking for nickel or gold, a nickel explorer might have started exploring, then the nickel price went nuts, and they suddenly got lots of investors, and their deposit was looking economic. And then suddenly the market is flooded with nickel. The technology wants the nickel, and the price is really good, but then the price starts to come down as the market is flooded and the demand is met. And if you're not all the way through and your mine's not ready to go, your price is suddenly a lot lower, and your economics for that deposit are a lot different. Whereas gold, on the other hand, gold might have been sitting at a relatively lower level, and then the price goes up a bit, you might be able to get something going, or the price goes down again, you shelve the project, and then the gold price goes bananas. I'm not sure if bananas is a statistical term, but it sure looks like it at the moment. The last year, the gold price has just gone up and up and up. So a lot of those deposits historically that might not have been economic, a exploration company can come back to and rerun the economics and look at the deposit again. Is it economic, and should they continue exploring with it? Other things that change, we have a lot of advanced computer modeling and new data that help us understand more and more about where these deposits are, and we're learning more and more about our deposit models, how the different metals get to where they are in place. And things have really changed over time as well. We used to use just a few elements and metals, and now if you think about all the different elements and metals that go in our current technology, we only need to look at even the battery technology. We've gone from lead acid batteries to lithium batteries to now sodium batteries. Sodium's not even on there. So we're starting to change out the minerals and elements that we need through time. So let's think about target generation. We start with a high-level exploration. The idea is to gather as much information as we can, either greenfields for where there hasn't been a lot of exploration, or brownfields if we're near other areas. We're collating all that together, putting it in some sort of system or data analysis to come up with some targets. And we're also considering environmental restrictions or where exploration is currently occurring as well in this process. So, for example, let's look for antimony tungsten. We're going to get as much information as we can about that metamorphic orogenic system, and we're going to map them out. So where are the source rocks? Where are the schists and the tectonic zones related to that metamorphism? Where are the faults and shear zones at that same time that can allow those fluids to transfer and get trapped? We're going to look for rock samples where there's high ore elements or our pathfinder elements, and we're going to look for stream sediment catchments as well. Where are some of these metals maybe eroding down into the rivers and streams that tell us there might be something upstream? We can put those into our favourite spatial analysis or our AI or whatever we're doing, and come up with a relative prospectivity model. So you can see the red hotspots there is perhaps where you want to go and start looking for to begin with. So we can see Central Otago, High Macraes, Reefton, Northwest Nelson and Marlborough all showing up. But there's a little dot here. Let's go have a look at that. That's Wellington. So the model located in an area about 10 kilometres west of us here today. It has anomalous rock chips, stream sediments, soil samples. It's got OK schist, some quartz veins and ductile zones. And it has a history of mining. And there was even some exploration here in the mid-1980s. And that explorer is here with us today. You may want to try and track them down in the morning tea and have a chat about it. Sorry, afternoon tea, isn't it? And there's a book and even a university thesis. So we've got an area not far from us to go and have a look at. But when we look at the council zoning, it's not actually that good a spot to go to. You know, it's an outstanding natural landscape. But let's assume for now that we're going to go and prospect it, and maybe it wasn't zoned that way. What are the steps we're going to go through? Well, prospecting, it's low impact, okay? You're going to need to apply for a permit from New Zealand Petroleum Minerals to undertake that activity. And you're going out there to do ground validation, do some basic mapping and sampling, and looking for indicator minerals. Then after 4 years or so, you're going to step up to an exploration program, an exploration permit, right? So the idea is to get you to something that you can drill and test. So more intensive sampling, you're engaging with university researchers. For Wellington, I'd be calling the Victoria University Share Zone modelling team here. And the idea is to work up to defining some sort of resource and also undertaking community engagement at these advanced exploration stages. Drilling is a really important part and step in exploration. It's testing the geology below the surface. It's sometimes called the truth machine or the big pointy lie detector, because it's validating the predictions the geologist makes, okay? And it's really expensive, $300 to $1,000 a metre. So one hole could cost you 100 grand or maybe over $10 million if you're in an advanced stage of drilling. So we're not talking small amounts of money. Mining and production. It's a long, what I'm trying to get across hopefully is it's a long road to getting to that point. Now, my friends and fellow speakers are going to talk more about this, but yeah, we're talking 35 years or more and a lot of money to get there. So just some key messages to take away today. We have a lot of mineral occurrences, and you may see them on maps as minerals everywhere, but not a lot of them are actually big enough to be deposits. And they form naturally deep inside our earth, and they're found in the ground and rivers and out on the seabeds. And we need to use our best science to understand where they are and how they occurred, because it takes a long time to find them. It's a really expensive process, and only a fraction of our prospects and targets might actually go through to being an economic deposit. We can use lots of geological data to help us guide the exploration. And when we're doing that, we're mapping, we're sampling, we're surveying, and using all those techniques to find where those minerals are concentrated. So, thank you very much. If you'd like any more information, we've got lots of websites and resources that you can refer to.
So so much. Matt will be around in the panel if you have any more questions about the exciting geology of minerals. Our next speaker is Professor Glenn Banks. He's coming to us from Massey University. He's a professor of geography. He's an expert in mining in New Zealand and the wider Pacific. And he's going to talk to us about the impacts of mining on communities and New Zealand society. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Caroline and Valentine. I'm not quite sure where he's got to. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for pulling together this day. I'm a big advocate for the need to have a lot more conversations about mining within Aotearoa. And this is a fantastic venue and you've pulled together a great bunch of people. So thank you. And thank you, Rachel and Co for coming along too. Really appreciate it. I want to pick up, Matt did a fantastic job. Where'd you go, Matt? Oh, did a great job and covered a lot of stuff that I was going to cover anyway, so I can whip through fairly quickly. I want to talk about some of the other non-geological aspects of critical minerals, or kind of the interface in some cases. And my basic key arguments, if you like, I don't think, and I think what Matt presented backs this up. We don't have a realistic prospects for a significant critical minerals mining sector. The short-term future of critical minerals and mining will involve small niche mines. There'll be byproduct or co-occurrence alongside some of the more mainstream minerals, if you like. And I think we'll hear from other speakers about some of the innovative secondary processing that might generate critical minerals as well. All in one of the things I'll, again, pick up on what Matt was saying, a very volatile kind of environment. Volatile in the economic sense and the geopolitical sense in particular. Critical minerals are not going to transform regional economies, and under the current regime, it's not going to contribute significantly to national growth for a bunch of reasons that I'll get to. And the bottom line here is that I think we need to make several key shifts in the approach that we take as a nation before the sector can drive more sustainable futures for Aotearoa. Adding to Matt's comments about occurrence, the critical minerals list has, as he pointed out, a number that are currently produced and minerals with potential to be produced. I want to pick on very briefly, just in terms of some of these categories and labels, a few of them. Matt underlined one of the points I was going to make, which is that aggregate and sand is perhaps our most critical of the mineral resources that are listed in the critical minerals list. There's some anomalies. Again, he pointed to coal and gold being there. Internationally, it's not a good look for us to have coal and gold there. It undermines some of the credibility of the whole sector and the notion of critical minerals internationally, because very few others have gold and coal as, none of the big players have coal and gold as critical minerals. And the other one that's weird, I think, that wasn't necessarily mentioned by Matt is aluminium on our list of critical minerals, because aluminium is not actually a mineral. It's not naturally occurring, which the official Crown Minerals Act says a mineral needs to be a naturally occurring thing. Aluminium is what we produce out of the bauxite that we import from Australia down at Tiwai Point. So I don't quite understand. It's a material, and it might be a critical material, but it sits uneasily for me on that critical mineral list. The next point I want to make about that critical mineral list, and again, Matt illustrated this quite nicely, I think, is that they're a very diverse set of minerals, and lumping them together is not necessarily very helpful. So we have copper on the list as one of the ones that we can perhaps produce. Globally, refined production of copper runs to about 28 million tonnes per annum. It bounces around. It's actually slightly lower than it was a few years back. Zirconium concentrate production around 1.2 million tonnes. So you can start to see already some fairly significant differences between the production rates of some of these minerals. Rare earth elements, about 390,000 tonnes. And then you get down to one that's on our list as potential to be produced, rubidium, and it tends to be produced as a byproduct of other things, again, as Matt kind of pointed to. The global output is 10 to 12 tonnes per annum. So you're talking about a vast range of volumes of different minerals used for different things, different quantities used in different places. And then you get, obviously, you throw an aggregate in the New Zealand context, and you're talking about something very, very different again. One of the other points I'd make is that there's a lack of transparent data on the production of many of these things here in New Zealand because the quantities are so small, and sometimes they're not even visible within supply chains. The economics of critical minerals is, dare I say, critical as well. A lot of them are characterised by small physical volumes, 10 to 12 tonnes per annum, for example. The thin or fairly opaque markets for some of these things. It's very hard to necessarily follow the commodity all the way through some of these supply chains. They all have typically, again, as I say, diverse lot, but typically high capital operating and processing refining costs, and some fairly extreme price volatility that Matt pointed to. The volatility itself, as Matt indicated, we can see some price spikes. I'll show you a few more in a minute. And the reason for some of those price spikes, they're not responding to simple supply and demand in the way that you would imagine a lot of other commodities respond to. So geopolitical risk can come and go, as we're seeing in terms of the Middle East right now, up and down, week to week. The price of oil is all over the place. Similar sorts of factors come into play when a president decides he's going to embark on a campaign to try and grab a lot more critical minerals from different parts of the world. Trade restrictions come into play as well. And the geopolitics of trade restrictions in the current environment is a large part of the calculation that needs to be done in terms of the price of any one critical mineral. And we also have shifting and changing defence and energy transition needs too. Depending on the mineral that you get, the one you want to look at, several of them are fairly deeply implicated in defence industries and defence technologies. And changes in defence spending, for example, will change the demand for some of these things quite dramatically. Some of these price spikes, though, it's worth pointing out, and Matt showed a nice example with nickel, are often very short term. So they will bounce around very, very quickly. And we'll get to some of the potential implications of that. So once they collapse, price can be influenced by new supply coming online. So one of the big ones, and nickel was a nice example, was the massive Chinese investment in Indonesia and the way in which that really impacted on the price of nickel. That was the part of the reason why it came down from the top very quickly. So Chinese investment in Indonesia led to Indonesia within 10 years going from, I think it was about 5th in terms of global producer to #1 global producer. So very rapid shifts in the calculations and the markets for these things. This volatility then is a major investment constraint and disincentive. So it's not an industry that really attracts a sector, the critical mineral sector. It's hard to attract investors into that kind of market for all the reasons that are listed there. Small volumes also don't necessarily equate to small risk. So a single new project or a single policy change in China can halve prices on some billion-dollar projects. That's why you're seeing a lot of negotiation and renegotiation and rethinking of existing mines in different parts of the world, including the US, including China, and here in Aotearoa as well. one of the implications of all of this, because of the geopolitical, geostrategic importance that's being developed around these, is the nation states getting involved in basically underwriting the development of some of these new prospects. So some of them are regarded as unbankable for all of the reasons that are listed there without policy support. So one part of the agreement that the US and Australia were in the process of negotiating with their critical mineral supply process was a pricing floor. So companies would only come in if there was a guaranteed minimum price for some of these products. So it's not a straightforward economic proposition, even if, as Matt points out, even if there is an occurrence of these things which looks economic at one point in time. Stuck here. What's going on? Try that. Okay, and just to underline the volatility equation, imagine you're in 2021 and you're looking at the price of nickel going through the roof there. Who wouldn't want to be part of that equation? Then by 2022, 23, who would want to be involved in that equation now? So, that kind of shift makes the investment in these sectors really, really tricky. And that's, if you spread that out over that entire period from 21 through to end of 25, you can see, imagine trying to be and thinking about investing in lithium over that period. Cobalt, another one, bouncing all around the place. And, these are not small shifts that we're talking about in terms of the price over relatively short periods of time. One of the things with cobalt is it was 10 years ago, it was integral to all of the batteries for EVs and those sorts of technologies, renewable transition, wind, solar panels, batteries, and the like. Now only about half of the batteries use cobalt. Innovations produced alternatives to cobalt in the use of batteries. So these sorts of innovation is a large, Morgan's going to come along and talk about innovation. That is a large part of the equation as well. It's technologies are changing and processes are changing really, really quickly. And then, there's nickel over a slightly longer time span, I think, than what Matt was showing. But look at that spike. Again, you'd sort of halfway up that spike, you think, this is something I want to be in. 2 weeks later, you want to be out of it as quickly as you possibly can. Just to underline this, here's the cover of an image of the cover of our critical minerals list that came out beginning of last year. And it shows heavy mineral sand concentrate containing critical minerals, titanium, and rare earth elements. This is a shot that was, the image is credited to Westland Mineral Sands. It's an operation which was forced to go into care and maintenance earlier this year due to weak global prices for titanium and mineral sands, volatile shipping, and energy costs. So that's a nice example of, it only started in 2023. So we're talking about volatility in a sector which can impact and has impacted on Aotearoa quite recently. What then are prospects for a significant critical minerals mining sector in Aotearoa? As I say, it's very highly diverse and largely not hugely profitable. Geologically, it's yet to be proven at scale. And even if it were, it's financially difficult to establish. So the short-term future for critical minerals and mining, I think, if it develops, will involve smaller niche mines, the co-occurrence, the byproduct of mainstream mining. So antimony alongside gold, titanium alongside iron ore, and so on. All in or innovative secondary processing, all in a volatile environment. And it's that co-occurrence with other minerals, with gold or iron ore, that does provide greater security for those people interested in chasing critical minerals. But again, in terms of the refining, it's the innovation, the technological innovation that's required. Shifting the equation, thinking about what does this mean for us as a nation, moving away from the resources and what happens to the benefits from them. one of the things, bluntly, the economic contribution of mining generally is consistently overplayed. And all the parties, it's interesting, all the parties at the recent fast track approval panels for mining operations have noted that the input-output models that they use, the standard model to estimate the indirect and induced effects for local economies and for national governments in terms of employment and local business, they've all noted that they overestimate. And in fact, the one for Santana actually had a statement saying, well, here's the number, but it's only going to happen if X, Y, and Z happens, which is building up local capacity and local skill sets and so on. It's very clear that mining will not of and by itself transform regional economies. Mining by itself is not going to do this. It needs to occur in a particular regulatory environment, and it occurs with the building up of a local economic ecosystem, if you like, to support the development of industry. And the international evidence from Australia, Canada, and elsewhere points to the need for this, for mining literate institutions, if you like, for a better understanding by government, local government, regional government of how to translate the benefits of mining into something that's actually contributes longer term to community development. And one of the problems with that is that the variability, that volatility that we talked about, plays out in terms of the profitability of mines and the range of factors that impact on mining operations at different points in their mine life. So one example that we don't necessarily always think about, but I'm sure the accountants, the financial managers in each one of the mines thinks about really deeply, is the price of oil and the fact that they are massive users of diesel. And the changes in the price of oil is going to impact hugely on the profitability of different mines. It helps if you're a gold mine and the price of gold's going through the roof, but for some of the other mining operations like Western Mineral Sands, that was one of the factors that led to them having to basically shut the door. So the variability in costs, the variability in the value of the resource that they're producing at any one point in time, all make the management of economic effects for sustainable benefits really difficult for operations, but for governments as well. And coming back to the regional dimensions, is mining going to transform regions? These are variations around deprivation index for across Aotearoa from 2013, 2018, and the last one's from the last census, which is housing deprivation. One of the points I want to make about these is that there are two long-standing regions which have had mining for a long time, for over a century, which rate very highly in terms of deprivation. So Bulla on the west coast and the Hauraki district in the Coromandel. There's a range of reasons you can say, okay, the other factors might come into play. But the bottom line is that mining does not necessarily translate into wealth for local communities and local regions. There's a whole bunch of other factors that need to align for that to happen. Moving on to the national economy, mining, bold statement, under the current regime, mining will not contribute significantly to the national economy. There's a bunch of reasons. One of them is the royalty regime, and royalties are a small component of the revenue flows of these mines. But the royalty regime we currently have in place isn't necessarily, I don't think, fit for purpose in terms of trying to ensure there's a fair share of the value of the resource stays in Aotearoa. And we developed a new royalty regime in 2012, and it's basically grandfathered for new mines which are operating on older leases, older exploration leases, even if it's 13 years later. If you develop a mine on an exploration lease that was in place back then, you still operate under the old regime rather than the double the rate that's currently in place. Now, I've got an issue with that 15 or 13 years later. A large part of the ability to retain value from the sector lies in the supporting industries in the ecosystem. And Australia is a real example of the way in which the massive industry over there has a whole economic infrastructure that sits behind it in terms of all the equipment, the infrastructure, all the elements that make the sector actually function and contribute to the growth of the sector. Without those, you're reliant on buying them all in and gathering them from elsewhere, and a lot of the money then flows offshore as well. Just on the Australian example, one of my bugbears is people who say, we've got to mine, we've got to open up mines, otherwise, and that's the reason why we're not doing as well as Australia. Here's a map of existing mines in Australia in 2025. These are not, this map kind of looks like some of the ones that Matt had, but these are existing mines. These are not mineral occurrences. And you can see that right across the country. Geosciences Australia note that there are 340 mines operating across Australia in 2025, and almost 100 of them are producing critical minerals or strategic minerals. 56 developing mines, with the majority associated with clean energy technologies. A surge in gold production driven by record high prices, 11 new gold mines coming online with 19 more in development. So that's a sector that's significantly larger than ours. Put those numbers down the bottom in perspective then. And here's a starting point. They reckon the statistic is that Australians' GDP per capita is about 30% higher than New Zealand. So they're about 30% wealthier than what we are, which is 1.3 times more wealthy. Australia exports 185 times more minerals than we do in terms of value. So there's clearly not a straight relationship between Australia being 1.3 times wealthier than us per person and the 185 times more mineral exports they require to produce that 1.3 times greater wealth per person. In other words, resource extraction is not the reason for the difference in wealth between Australia and New Zealand. And what we don't need is more of this, which is based on this idea that Australia's wealthy because it mines. That quote by Matthew Hooton is actually why I started paying attention to mining in New Zealand, having done a lot of work, most of my work up in places like Papua New Guinea, which, how can you come out and say why mining is New Zealand's last chance to avoid third world status? Working in places in the global south, in places like Papua New Guinea, you see that mining doesn't bring wealth. There's not a direct correlation there. So that started me getting quite vexed about mining, and then along came Shane Jones. So getting towards the end then, mining under the current regime, coming back to some of these points I've made, other reasons why under the current regime, significant contribution to the national economy, it will contribute. Let's not beat around the bush. It will generate jobs and it will generate some tax for government, but that tax will bounce all around the place. And the example that's been used a few times recently is to look at the tax paid by Oceania Gold over a period between 2020 and 2025. And for 2 years of that 6-year period, they were exporting about 500 million bucks worth of gold a year. They paid 0 corporate income tax in New Zealand. Last year, they paid $220 million in income tax, and we heard about it. And what that shows is the variability that you get with corporate income tax. So you don't get a straight, steady revenue stream to government. It will bounce all around the place. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. High levels of offshore ownership. Oceania is 100% virtually 100% offshore owned. High capital intensity, high rates of depreciation. They have big kit. They have big trucks. They have stuff like that. And there's high rates of depreciation on that, which reduces the amount that ends up being paid to the government along the way. And there's the cost that's often, it's not necessarily avoided, but it's not necessarily completely covered either, the cost of covering the long-term environmental risks. So this is where some of the debates with things like tailing dams, for example, come into play, the tailings dams are going to be there forever. Where is what's the assurance that there's going to be the revenue available to government to cover off on some of these things? There's a wise old economist, I don't know if Jeff's in the room. Wise old economist, Jeff Bertram, used to be here. 15 years ago, mining will not increase economic welfare. On the contrary, it will often reduce it if done in the wrong place or in the wrong way or without the proper legal and regulatory framework. Mining therefore presents industry-specific problems for regulators and policymakers which cannot be finished by overgeneralized rhetoric or glamorous photography. Kind of a mantra that we might like to think about is the right mine, the right place, the right time. So what do we need to do with the sector? And I've got messages for the sector and I've got messages for the government. This is a great soapbox to have. For the sector, I think the sector needs to realise that cowboys in government will come and go. We like to talk about cowboys in industry in the sector, but there's cowboys in government that will come and go, and the sector needs to adopt a more longer-term horizon. Things politically are not always going to be the same as what they currently are. We need to recognise too, or the sector needs to recognise that a sustainable mining sector needs social licence. You need to have the company on board. I was talking to somebody the other day and we were sort of blue sky. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could find a mining company that spent as much on the massive amounts of exploration that Matt was talking about, had an equivalent spend on community at the same time? You don't find it. And there's reasons why not, but maybe that's the sort of approach that needs to be taken. And this social licence needs to be built with communities, with iwi and with the non-human world. The fast-track panel hearings for Trans-Tasman Resources were really interesting when Taranaki Mauna had a seat at the table and was able to express a view on the mining development. And that's the first time that had happened anywhere. And I think that's the sort of approach that needs to be taken. Listen, build relationships and communicate authentically. Just about at the end, Carolyn. A sustainable mining sector for Aotearoa, for the government, let's be realistic. Let's be evidence-based on what the sector can do, what it can achieve, what benefits it will bring, and the risks that it poses, the environmental, the economic, and the social. And part of this is recognising that there are limits to where it should go and where it shouldn't go. There's work that needs to be done to ensure a fair share of the value of the resource benefits the country. And we'll hear more about this from some of the speakers coming up. Mining is not like dairy. The dairy industry, you get it wrong one year, prices are down one year, you come back, you got basically the same cows, the same pasture, you do it all over again. Mining, you get one shot. You've got the resource, once it's extracted, it doesn't come back and jump back in the hole to be mined all over again. So you get one shot at this. Part of what that means is you need to see resources and their value as intergenerational. And we don't necessarily think about this enough. Yes, there might be gold in the ground now, let's rip it in. What about future generations and their stake in the resources in the ground? Build on some existing examples of what works. And there are some pretty cool things out there, some pretty cool initiatives. I mean, we've got a completely, I think it's completely the Taharoa Iron Sands up in the west coast of the North Island. It's an iron sand operation export. They ship it off. Who's it owned by? It's owned by the local iwi, the local community up there. That's a model that, hey, why aren't we talking more about that kind of corporation? There's a really cool example. You may have seen it. McRae's Flat have one of their big digger shovels is fully electric. So shifting away from diesel to fully electric, these things are massive, you know, the size of this room. Apparently there might be some issues with it, like you plug it in and all the lights on the South Island sort of dim a little bit as a result. But that sort of thinking, that sort of technology, it's not true. But that kind of technology, that kind of innovation, I think, is the sort of thing that can drive the energy, the sector forward. Build on some of these examples that are out there. Communicate, facilitate, educate, and perhaps don't adopt the Shane Jones shouty approach. So my basic message here is we need a different, better, there's an academic term for it, which we can throw in there, a convivial conversation about the costs, the benefits, the options, the alternatives, and the ways forward for how we need mining. We need to have these things for all the reasons that Matt was talking about, that we need to have aggregate, if nothing else. Otherwise, how do we fill in the potholes in our highways? So we need to find ways of living well with extraction. And that's my key message. So thank you.
So much, Glenn. That's really passionate and full of good insights. I want to invite our next speaker, Rachel Arnott from. Rachel she represents Te Runanga o Aotearoa Nui. We're really privileged to have her here and to speak about Aotearoa Nui's perspectives on mining, and particularly focusing on the whenua, kaitiakitanga, and tikanga. Really appreciate your time and coming down here to speak with us, and please welcome Rachel.
Ria te reto tāra ke we te kō mako e kō wakatai rangatira, rere ki uta, rere ki tai. Ia au, ia te mea nui o te ao, he tangata ti hei mauri. Tua tai ka mihi ki te rangatira he mihi ki a mātou, e taina mai mātou ki te kāranga o tēnei kaupapa. E tika nā mihi ki te hau kāinga te Aotearoa. Me he ti atu iwi e huri nua o te whenua nei. Nā mihi ki a rātou maunga, a rātou awa he riri nei, me nā pā, nō reira tēnā tata katoa, tuatai Aotearoa, e mihi kawana ki nā mati o te wā, ne nā mati aere a te rā, aere ki te kāinga tūturu o nā tangata, kaori hoki mai, wai o te rātou tungu mati ki a rātou, hoki mai ki a tātou tungu re tēnei wā. Nā mihi hoki ki a koutou he tū tēnei kaupapa ki te wakaroa i nā kōrero mai tēnei tangata ki tēnei tanga tai tēnei wā. Nō reira ka mihi ki a Matt me Glenn, o koutou kōrero, mihi ki a koe Glenn, i o tono kui a mātou Ngāti Rune, haere mai ke wangari o koutou i tēnei wā. E runga tēnei atamira. Nō reira, ka mihi ki a koe, ia koe metai, kia koe, met, joy, metai. Ka mihi kia koe, e hoki mai hi nā maumahara tō mahi, kei wangori o nā iwi e pāna tātou wai, pēhea mātui tiaki. Engari, nā mihi kia koe hoki. Ko tai mai mātou, mai te maunga o Taranaki, e riri atu ki tā awa e riri nei, mai te awa o whenua kura, tai noa ki wai nonoro, mai wai nonoro ki uta ki whakahurangi. Nei te rohi o Ngāti Rune, moho ao, tangahoi, te pakakoi, e taina mai kei wanguria tātou koutou i tēnei wā. Engari, e whakaro hoki ki a mātou uri, a mātou hapu, i roto tērā roi e tēnei wā. Nō re, tēnā tātou katoa. Kei mua koutou ko nā pari nui taku ingo. No rangatāpu I teti hapu. O Ngāti Rūni, I roto a mātou, tekau mā ono nā hapu, I roto a tātou roi. Mai te awa e riri nei, te awa wenua kura, ko Ngāti Hine Waiata, me Ngāti Hine, mai te marae, wenua kura. Haere atu ki te pā Waioturi, rangatāwhi pūkorokoro nā hapu e noho ana kei reira. E wakapiri ki te awa e rere nei, te awa taikeu, te marae, Pariroa pā, e noho ana nā hapu Ngāti Tūpato, Ngāti Renge Tuatahi Kotuku. E hari tonu mai tērā marae Pariroa ki Manutahi, e noho ana te hapu kei reira ko Ngāti Tāku. E rere atu ki te mai tērā pāki o Hengai, Mere Mere, e noho ana nā hapu, Ngāti Hine, tūpakaihu, nā riki, kāre mātou I wari te pā Mokoia, te Purple Palace ki a mātou. E hari tonu ki te pā hoki, taipare nui, e noho ana nā hapu, Āmoa, Āpotiki, e hari tonu ki te pā Anatiki, e noho ana te hapu, Ngāti Awe, me e ti atu hoki, te hari tonu ki Parepuni, ki nā hapu, e noho ana kei reira, Ngāti Tapaia, Ngāti Tanauai, te wehi atu mai tērā marae ki Ngārongo, e noho ana ārau kuku, ki a tātou pā mutunga, ko ahitahi tērā te hapu e noho ana kei reira whakaurangi, no reira ka mihi ki a tātou anō. So I just explained from the river of Whenua to Wainonoro and to a place called Whakaurangi, which is Stratford. And there sits the 16 hapu, and there I just about those hapu, 16 hapu, and the pā they belong to. So our role there is Ngāti Rūni as hapu, as whānau, as uri of the community to look after, to be kaitiaki of our sea, our whenua, and kei runga, kei raro, kei waho, kei roto. So everywhere around the taio hoki, that's our roles and responsibilities as a kaitiaki. And I just want to mihi also to Debbie has been a big fighter for that kaupapa and chasm and other whānau they've been part of, despite whās around the kawa o te moana. I see that our presentation to here. So I'll just hand it over to Rachel and she can do her part.
Kia ora whānau, ko Rachel Arnott Takinua. I'm Uri Aho of Ngāti Donui, and I'm here to speak on behalf of Ngāti Donui. Thank you, Alton. So TTR should be TTR, not with the S, sorry. Plan, obviously, I don't know if you know much about it. An application went in a few years ago, so this has been about 12 years in the making. Ngāti Donui has been fighting the fight and will continue to do so until there's evidence to say otherwise. So at the moment, the application is to have 50 tonnes uplifted, vacuumed, like a vacuum cleaner, I suppose, and then return 45 and dump them and keep 5 million tonnes for 35 years. One of the other issues we probably had with TTR, just while we start there, is the engagement or the lack of. So a lot of these applications are done without iwi engagement. So some of our whānau put our, that's partly why we put our hands up and backs up, I suppose, is around what's going on in our backyard and where's the consultation with our whānau, hapu and marae on the ground and keeping it grassroots as well. So that's one of the biggest concerns. And obviously with the plume that it creates, and it's the size of our maunga. So when we think about taranaki, it's the size of the maunga. So this really is a concern for us is what that looks like and the impacts it's going to have for our future. And next to me is also Graham Young. Graham Young has worked alongside me for a number of years and been fighting the fight. So Graham's going to also be part of this presentation. So I'm going to pass it on to Graham Young.
Kia ora, everybody. Graham Young, Ngāti Runui, and been working for Ngāti Runui for the past 16 years. And for, I think, about 11 of those years, we've been embraced with TTR and their iron sand mining project. And I suppose for a long time, why did we object to TTR coming along, looking for, not so much that I think it started out as iron sands, but the rare minerals became the more bigger focus as the years went on, and the ones that were talked about earlier by the speakers. But we really did object to this largely because of the things that you see there on the screen, but we didn't object to this as a naive iwi who all of a sudden were faced with a large company like TTR turning up on our back door. For the last 20 to 25 years, Ngāti Runui had the largest number of oil wells in its backyard with 36 current productive oil wells happening over that period as well. Ngāti Runui is the only iwi in the country that is blessed and endorsed a deep sea oil well, OMV's one sitting in off our South Taranaki Bay. So we did not come into this as some might project us as Luddites, and has no intelligence in terms of which was recently discussed in Parliament about us. But we did not come into this as a naive little iwi who decided to object. We came in it with a wealth of oil and mineral experience. And what you can see there is really our fight was really about the protection of our environment, what Rachel has talked about, what Ngāpari has articulated as well. We're not opposed to development, but it must be backed by solid science and also that whole social license and the protection that Ngāpari talked about in our role as kaitiakitanga is so important. And so really the last point there that we make is that we really need to, and I think that was talked about by Glenn, making sure the balance was right between community, the science, the right to explore and have a look at minerals, but making sure that you take them all along. Rachel made the point, none of that was there. And so therefore Ngāti Runui objected to the TTR.
Part of our engine room has been led by Justine Inn's legal team, Ocean Law. We've had her for the last 12 years and she continues the fight with us. With that is also our team. So you'll see Nicola and Graham as the manager there of that. And we've just had some really important people in our roles. Rukatai, you might have seen, he does a lot of mahi with Greenpeace as well, and he's been in the papers in regards to going overseas to protest and things like that. He is our one of our kautura that alts, and he's also our cultural lead. So he's been actively on the ground protesting and doing things that our whānau obviously agree with, as well as Haimone, our chair. He is currently based in Palmerston North. And he was an apology for today. But that's really our team of experts. There's been really, actually they've all been there for at least 10 or plus years. Hyman has been the chair the whole time since, how long is he? About 15 years now. 15 years he's been our chair. So none of us have actually gone away. I've actually been working for Ngāti Runui for 20 plus years. So as well. So I've been alongside Graham for a number of years and nothing's really changed. We're very focused on the future for our mokona.
So our approach has been based on those 4 points that you could see there. Our one has been based on a number of things, and it's not just about the headline grabbing ones like the first one maybe, but public protest and media profile were quite critical for us to voice our opinion, because often the regulatory process doesn't allow you to actually engage in a social license. So we actually took the opportunity to take the community along with us. So collaborating where necessary with other groups, including Greenpeace and Chasm, Kiwis Against Seabed Mining, was quite critical for us to join a momentum of opposition. So that was part of one PO that we had. Obviously, the legal challenge, the consenting side was significant to us. You may not be aware, but we were actually architects with the National Party in developing the EEZ legislation in 2011. We actually uphold that piece of legislation because to date, it is actually, the guardrail has been created, which has stopped TTR progressing for the last 12 years. So the EEZ legislation we're actually proud of because it actually did what it was meant to do. Apart from one decision that was made by a casting vote, but the court then threw it out. We're quite pleased that the legislation that we helped design was actually protected us. So legislation can help you along the way. At the same time, a bit of a juxtaposition we had going on is that in exactly the same place where TTR wanted to mine, we also had the offshore wind industry coming forward in the last 5 years in saying they wanted to locate in the exact same place. So we were not only fighting TTR or opposing TTR, we actually were also listening to the other side of the coin with renewable energy and looking at the sustainability and what were potential opportunities for renewable things. And we were also significantly engaged, obviously, through that process with the EPA, through EEZ, and of course, later on about the fast track process as well.
So the timeline. So TTR formed in 2007. Their first application went in 2013 to mine for 66 square kilometres, which is a huge area of the seabed. Then in 2014, it was rejected, from EPA. And in 2016, they relodged. They actually won in 2017 by the decision that went to the chair at the time. They voted for it. Then we went to High Court. So it's been quite a journey. In 2018, we won. And then 2020, we were back in Court of Appeal, which we won. And 2021, it was lodged again at the Supreme Court, which it was also referred back to EPA. So the process went back again. And then they refiled in 2023. We were at in Hawera. They had a court case session. We're at the hub in Hawera. We had all our whānau. It was open to everyone. And then during that process, TTR withdrew because it wasn't going their way. And obviously, for fast track was coming on along. So if they had a decision there, they probably couldn't have had the fast track application.
So some of the key issues, look, a lot of you will be aware of some of these, and it's what Rachel's already talked about. Seabed mining is just like a huge quarry under the sea, but of course it has a very much different level of complexity compared to an onshore mine. In fact, you'd probably never see an onshore mine quite that size, I suspect. Seabed mining will create a plume, and this is one of the biggest issues that we rallied against, was the size of the plume, the size of the maunga, Mount Taranaki. So the seabed plume will reduce sunlight, reducing kaimoana and reducing all life effectively from off the South Taranaki Bight right down to here in Wellington. So it effectively will significantly impact reefs and other fragile ocean environments. Now, there's lots of different science out there, and you can find other science that will potentially tell you that it won't. So we're not denying that there are differing views, but it's how you bring all those views together and then apply things like the precautionary principle under the EEZ Act legislation. And that's really where TTR fell over. So as you can see, there was also impacts on migratory paths of whales and dolphins, seabirds, and that's not under the water so much, although seabirds obviously feed off of kaimoana, but it was also about light and noise from the onshore for the seabed going vessels that were there operating 24 hours. Obviously, reefs were a big factor for us in terms of things like rock lobster and shellfish. Obviously, I've talked about the ongoing vessels on top, which operate for 24 hours a day, all under artificial light. there's huge amount of contaminants from what they bring up and then redeposit into the ocean. And there's also a huge amount of deposits that will come ashore and could affect how the natural environment is affecting the accretion and erosion within our environment as well. There's also quite a high risk of heavy toxic metals in them. And basically where the mine is, it will just kill everything. Nothing survives here. And their argument was that, it'll all slowly come back to life eventually. But that's a little bit vague in terms of an approach. And also because of what they're digging up and the hole they create, we could actually have a change in wave patterns along the coastline. And also right down to the whole impact of water clarity, which is quite essential for life. So that's some of the key issues that we had a really strong debate. And for 11 years, we've had a range of scientists and a range of experts present differing views right from across the world, not just here in Aotearoa, but from across the world, there have been differing views. And that's been quite significant in how the EPA, the courts, and effectively then the fast track panel had to consider all of this. Wasn't an easy job. Ngāti Rune kept an open mind about all of this, but it could never reach a conclusion that it satisfied our kaitiakitanga role. So perhaps when the Supreme Court actually spoke on this, this is probably, excuse the pun, a watershed moment in legal law was the Supreme Court, because what it did was, as you can see on the first po there, it actually raised the whole issue of the significance of tikanga and the Treaty of Waitangi and the role that plays in an environmental decision making. Never before has this been so eloquently articulated in a decision about our role and the importance of taking that into consideration in a consent that was being sought for. So this is a significant decision. And that is something that the previous panels really struggled with. We were probably nice to listen to, but did they really want to take us seriously? And they perhaps didn't take us seriously. And the Supreme Court said, you really erred in law by not taking us seriously. And that's quite a significant ruling. Obviously, environmental bottom lines, you probably guys, quite an academic audience, I suspect here. You all know about environmental bottom lines and what that means. The Supreme Court made quite a harsh judgment. But perhaps the Supreme Court made one of its other most important one was the precautionary principle that is set out in the EZ Act, which basically said, if you actually think something is going to cause harm, you really have to look at what your precautionary principle are. And there's huge debate about how that's interpreted through this decision, but we always argued that. Ngāti Rūnui, tikanga is about precaution. It is about the protection of our environment. And so that's why I go back to the fact that the guardrails of the EZ stood up and it said you cannot do this because you haven't proved your case.
And with that, we obviously have a media focus of pushing back. We had about 3 protests, one in Hawara at the Waihi Beach. We also had one in Patia, Mana Bay, the Patia Beach there. We also obviously came to Parliament with signatures and things like that to try and stop seabed mining in the South Taranaki Bight. As well as ensuring that we had headlines and just educating our people on the way and having their voice and a lot of huis. We had a lot of wānanga, marae huis, our potura out there talking to their people as well, because like Uncle said here, that there's 16 hapu, which means there's 16 reps that stand for Ngāti Rūnui currently. They're actually my bosses. But they're out there actively, getting the message across. And I think what's really important is that we could share that. We also have a newsletter, a pānui that goes out to our uri, so everyone gets an email, and our pāki actually get it printed and hard copy because of the age, and we've decided that that's what they'd like, being older. But one of the important things is ensuring that, we have a lot of young ones that were 5, 6, 7. They're now at high school writing reports about this. Or they're coming in, it's like, or they're having babies now. They were part of the journey the last 12 years with us. So it's really, really been part of their history, this fight as well. Not saying that it won't change and science will come to us and we may change our minds and things like that, but as it currently stands, it's a no from Ngāti Rōnui, and we will fight until we get the answers that we need to ensure that the kaitiaki for our mokopuna is there for the future for them. Kia ora. Got one more sign. Okay. So the panel, this is the fast track. Oh no, this is the one before the fast track. Oh, it's the fast track one. Sorry, aroha mai. This is thank God that they rejected this. It was actually quite a challenging. So we just went out of court in 2024. They withdrawn. So it was like, where are we going? Where will we stand? It was actually a really hard time for us because a lot of our people were like, what's going on? And it was really hard to explain that they've just withdrawn. There was no real explanation. So when fast tracking came up, we were like, well, this is what we expect. This is what we think they're doing. It was around also ensuring that they understand that they could go and put another application in, because I think some of our whānau get a bit hōhā when we've been to High Court and Supreme Court and all these, and the cost that's been involved in that. There has been a very high cost to the iwi. But fast track actually stood up. It was actually really good, and not just, it is about the others that come along with us. It's the chasms, it's the Greenpeace, it's other hapu, it's ngā iwi o Taranaki. So it was awesome that we could have our colleagues support us in our application against, because there weren't actually that many. If we think about the fast track applications that were actually for it, majority was against. It was about 3 days. It was actually, and a lot of our kids came along so we had kuras even involved. So the kura kaupapa, we have Te Paepae o Aotearoa, we have Pāti Area School. They all attended these. It was open. So I think for educational purposes, it was really helpful that they got to listen and understand. But again, it was the same faults that Graham was talking about, the impacts of the tikanga, the fishing, what the benefits were. Again, there was an argument around jobs, and then they had to be experts. So it was a questionable around what did that look like? Because there's no experts here in Taranaki at the moment. So where are they coming from? So how's the benefit to us as iwi when they're trying to tell us there's jobs, but actually there was all these experts and rules put in place, and they had to be this qualified, this, So a lot of it was quite hard to see, but it was also, well, actually that doesn't benefit us. We need to know what those jobs are so we can train our people now and how we can work alongside them and to upskill our rangatahi especially. But yes, we won that. And yeah, it was actually, and TTR withdrew just before the application. So again, we're in that same limbo. They didn't get the decision, so because they withdrew it again. So we're actually in the same place we were in 2024, wasn't it? 21 really. So we're in limbo right now. We don't know where they're sitting, whether we're getting another application, which we suspect we will. But we do know that the fast track costs quite a bit of money for them to put the application in the first place. So each time they're doing these applications, it is costing them. But it's also costing us when we're putting up the fight. But we'll do that for generations. I won't be the first and I won't be the last. Yeah.
Oh, tō reira, mai mātou I taina mai kei wangari a koutou. He nui te mihi ki a koutou ki te wakarongo ki a mātou o tēnei whaiwhai, mo a tātou whānau I roto a tātou roi. Kaore a mātou I roto te tai hauru areke, o te motu o Aotearoa, tēnei whaiwhai. So on behalf of us, we just want to thank everybody for listening to us today. And we're all fighting the same fight around this kaupapa. And even though it's in the Taiauru area, but it could happen to anywhere around the motu. So, nō reira, tēnā tātou kati.
Makes me really emotional. I really appreciate you coming and talking about your struggle and how you protected your whenua for your mokopuna and rangatahi, and your dedication to doing that, you know, ad infinitum forever to respect the future generations' ties to their place is really moving. Thank you. And thank you for the support from the audience as well. Our next speaker, just before we have our next speaker, I'd like to collect questions for the panel. So this is the QR code for Mentimeter. If you have a question, it's limited to 100 participants because I only have the free version. But if you have a question for the panel, which will take place after our final speaker, please do submit it sooner rather than the last minute, because I need to sort of compile them for our moderator. So as the next speaker is speaking and during the afternoon tea, please submit your questions so that we can have a good panel discussion. So the next speaker we have is Morgan Lowther. Morgan is a research scientist, specifically a materials scientist who works at the Robinson Research Institute. It's a part of the UW. Morgan is an expert in refining, like what goes into getting the metals or the critical minerals out of the rocks. And what are the things that we need to consider about that process? So thank you for coming to speak today, Morgan. Thanks so much.
Kia ora all. I appreciate I'm one of the last barriers between you and an afternoon tea, so I'll try and keep things succinct. So as mentioned, I'm a research scientist at the Robinson Research Institute, part of Victoria University of Wellington. We're a research-only institute, about 80 staff, PhD student, although that number has gone up. And we've got a long background in superconductors, material science. If anyone's been paying attention, we have something on the International Space Station, first ever superconducting magnet in space, the HECI mission, which is due down shortly. Now, I am not part of the space team. I keep my boots firmly on the ground. I'm part of the clean materials team, and we're focused instead on clean processing of New Zealand minerals. Because we're broadly, I think, as a country, New Zealand has a very healthy conversation about mining. It's very open, it's very public, and everyone can kind of visualize and understand what a mine is and what mines are for, but we're not always great at talking about what happens to the minerals when they leave the mine. It's all well and good digging this stuff up, but what are we doing with it? Well, we're trying to turn these minerals into some form of product, some sort of final material to then go into your phones, your car batteries, whatever it is. And this arrow from A to B is doing a lot of heavy lifting. This is refining. It's a catch-all term. But broadly speaking, refining is the process of taking a mineral and removing the unwanted impurities or the extraction of a target element or compound. So those could be metals. We're talking an awful lot about metals today, ranging from your structural metals like iron, crucial for the New Zealand economy. I always like to talk about this, even if it's not on the critical minerals list. If you want to build a multi-story building in New Zealand, it needs to be seismically safe. The best way to do that is steel, and you need iron to do that. Aluminium is crucial for lightweight materials. Vanadium's come up today already and will come up again. Crucial for a lot of modern technologies. Titanium for hip replacements, and your technological metals. Copper, we still need a lot of copper for electronics. And neodymium. If anyone goes past a wind turbine on the way home, there's a fair chunk of neodymium in the magnets, the rare earth magnets, in the generators in your wind turbines, and in the motors in electric cars and hybrid cars. That being said, it's not always just metals. It's important to say that we don't just pull metals from minerals, we also pull certain compounds. So those might be oxides, silica, titanium dioxide I'll come back to throughout this talk. That is what is used to make things white, papers, pigments, paints, plastics. It's titanium dioxide primarily. But it could also be things like calcium oxide for our cement industry, the precursors for your lithium batteries, and even the tungsten carbide you need to make mining equipment that can actually drill through rock. And these are, as has come up, Matt kind of discussed this quite eloquently as well, these are technologically essential materials, particularly for decarbonisation of industry. We are reliant on these as a modern economy, both in New Zealand and globally. But it's important to say, I've used refining as this nice little catch-all term. Oh, you just do some refining and you get some stuff at the end. It's not a one-step process. It can be a very technologically complex process to get from an ore through some form of concentration, through then a load of chemical processing to get an actual product material. Those could be hot processes, wet chemical processes, electrochemical processes. And oftentimes you can trade materials at different points in this chain. It's not just a case of, oh, you can either sell a rock or you can sell a final product. You can often sell those intermediate products as well, and those might be globally traded. So not only might you have to deal with volatility in the price of a final product, but you also see volatility in the intermediate products as well. And it's quite useful to actually look at an example process for this. So again, I'm gonna stick with titanium for quite a lot of this talk, because as has been mentioned, we have a lot of mineral sands in New Zealand, along the west coast of South Island, and those mineral sands are primarily ilmenite. And if you wanted to refine those, what might you do? Well, you concentrate it down with some magnetics and electrostatics. That's not chemical processing. That's just getting rid of as much of the rock that you don't want out of your sand first. Then you'll do some form of chemical process. I've chosen something called a synthetic rutile process. And there you're stripping out as much of the iron that's in your mineral as you can to get something that's about 95% purity. And then you go through some final processing to make a metal. And as you're doing each of these processes, you're introducing other reagents. You're introducing chemical reagents, thermal reagents. You're introducing a lot of energy here, both chemical and thermal. So that could be oftentimes using a lot of coal. A lot of these processes are still very reliant on carbon as a source, both for removing oxygen and as a fuel source for heat. And you may even be using things that have been through an awful lot of refining themselves. For making titanium metal, you actually need magnesium metal as a precursor to help pull some of the chlorine off your titanium chloride that you make through the process. So you actually need to make magnesium before you can make titanium. And that has its own footprint associated with it, particularly when you start looking at things like carbon footprint. So each of these processes has a carbon footprint associated with them. And as you're stepping down this process chain, getting closer and closer to your final product, what you're doing is you're increasing energy intensity and you're effectively increasing the CO2 equivalent being emitted in these processes. Now, some of this might be direct emissions, but some of this may also be the kind of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions that are associated with the production of your other compounds that are being used to refine. And these impacts, it's important to say, are significant and actually often outweigh those of a mine. I'm not saying by any means that we should ignore the impact of mines themselves. It's a very important part of the conversation. But an important part of the conversation is actually that it's purification and refining, when you look at environmental indicators, that have an outsized impact in the actual full life cycle from mine to material. Now, this graph has a lot of data on. You don't need to worry about specifics, but broadly what you're seeing here is that actually the yellow bar, the mining and the concentration step on these 4 indicators that were studied in this one life cycle analysis, mining is not the dominant factor. It's actually the refining that is the dominant factor on several of these really crucial environmental indicators. And this goes beyond just these environmental indicators as well. And it's important to say that these impacts are not geographically constrained to your mine sites. It's actually comparatively rare to do your refining at the mine. Refineries need an awful lot of electricity, they need a lot of energy, they have power demand, and they also need to be able to bring chemicals in and products out. So you actually site your refinery for logistics. So this is just one example. This is a titanium dioxide process line in South Africa, and they ship their mineral sands 400 kilometers to their processing plant, all in South Africa, because the processing plant is next to a bay where they can ship material in, ship it out, and they actually have an electricity supply. So just looking at mine site effects is not enough to accurately assess the sustainability of an overall process, or to really even understand where the dominant sustainability impacts are. Iron making is a really easy example to make the case for here, to demonstrate this. If you look at iron ore, about 55% of global iron ore is exported from Australia. Big bulk digging ship, they chuck it on a massive boat, most of it goes to China. Great. Well, 90% of global iron is actually refined via blast furnaces. So this is a process where you're using coal, coking coal specifically, that metallurgical coal that is on the critical minerals list for New Zealand, good or ill, to both remove oxygen, so your carbon is combined with oxygen in your iron ore to produce carbon dioxide, and also as a thermal fuel to heat the reactor and to melt the iron that is coming out the bottom of this reactor. So you can collect a nice stream of high purity pig iron coming out the bottom of your reactor. But this is carbon intensive. We're directly emitting CO2 in this process. This is a good example of direct CO2 emissions. So 1.5 to 2 tons of CO2 is produced per ton of iron metal out of this process. Now, we use a lot of iron. Iron and steel making accounts for about 28% of global CO2 direct emissions, and then, industrial emissions. So it's about a quarter. So it's about 7 to 9% of global CO2 emissions are directly from iron and steel making. So you could make the argument that Australian iron ore is responsible for around about 4 to 5% of all global CO2 emissions. But none of that's being emitted in Australia. Australia doesn't have very many steel refineries. They are exporting all of this iron ore. So it's a really good example of just how disconnected these impacts can be. They're not geographically constrained. I want to address this kind of early on, because this is actually a really important part of the conversation around mining is, what about recycling? Why don't we just recycle everything and just stop digging? And we have to unfortunately be realistic about this. Demand is still increasing for pretty much every mineral and every metal. This is both a combination of global population growth and industrialization. There are a lot of populations that are still industrializing and turning around to someone and saying, we've got all the steel we want, you guys don't get to have any, you're too late to the game. That doesn't really work. And we've also got new applications. And lithium's a great example of this. Pretty much every bit of lithium that's ever been mined is in a battery now already, and we still need more batteries. So there are two aspects to that demand. It's not just population growth, it's also technological advancement, as Glenn was discussing. And there are fundamental limits of recycling. Modern products are incredibly complex. If you want to strip down a modern product, say a fully integrated electric vehicle now, into every component element that's in there, it's going to be less sustainable, unfortunately, than digging new lithium. And added to that, you've also got the fact that you are fundamentally fighting against entropy. Some of the materials we produce, modern steel, might have 10, 15 alloying elements in it. To strip those out atom by atom, you are quite literally fighting the laws of physics. So unless demand fundamentally changes, resource extraction is an unavoidable reality for the foreseeable future, and we need to own up to that and take account for it. So what could critical mineral refining look like in Aotearoa? As Matt kind of very eloquently discussed, there are a lot of different potential elements available in New Zealand. How many of these are actual realistic resources is an entirely different question. But there are 3 broad approaches to mineral refining happening here in New Zealand. One is refining all the way to a final product. So this is what happens at New Zealand Steel. They dig iron sand, it gets shipped to from Waikato North Head to Glenbrook Steel Plant, and they make a final product material. They go through all of the refining steps, and a final product steel feeds the New Zealand economy. Really nice example. We also do refining to intermediates. So if you look at OceanaGold and the other gold mines in New Zealand, they don't produce pure gold. They actually produce something called gold doré, a mix of gold and silver. That goes to the Australian Mint for the final refining. So they're shipping and selling a traded intermediate. And there's finally the refining overseas example. So Taharoa Iron Sands was mentioned, really good example of this, where they are mining their iron sand and that's being sold overseas. But equally, the South Island heavy mineral sand consents are also currently dig and ship operations where they dig it up, they concentrate it up, and they send it overseas. They don't do any chemical processing themselves. Now, our goal as a research group, and I think it should be a goal that we should all get behind as a country, is to try and actually onshore more refining, because there are significant impacts associated with refining that we should be taking account of, and we can do that in a sustainable way. If we look at the history of attempts to refine New Zealand ilmenite, as mentioned, Western Mineral Sands are going through some economic difficulties at the moment. They're not the first to face this. This has happened frequently, and it's driven by a number of different factors, one of which is our mineralogy. We have quite unique mineral deposits around New Zealand. Ilmenite sands in particular are very included with additional garnets, and so it means you have to develop a unique process. And on this timeline, multiple companies have come through, had consents to start developing these sorts of processes, doing loads of an immense library of industrial R&D that's done, patents. There was even a brief pilot mineral plant down at Barrytown, and then an economic downturn hits. That's what the red dashed lines are here. And you'll note that after each red dashed line, companies hold on for 2-3 years, and then they go, we're out of the game, pass it on to someone else. Because the margins were sufficiently thin that when the market shifts, capital investment is just viewed as not worthwhile. And that comes back to that volatility in price markets. You really see that particularly with titanium's a really good example for this. You look at the price of titanium in 2022, it spiked massively. And that's because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the loss of refining from the Zaporizhzhia refining plants. There are a number of historic drivers for why you get dig and ship. And that is part of it, is that investing in capital plant is expensive. Processing requires labor, energy, reagents, capital investment for plant, and remediation of any waste. And historically, this is less the case now, but it is still true to an extent, China in particular had a significant market advantage. They had a lot of cheap coal that they were willing to burn. And thermal energy in particular is very expensive if you can't just be burning coal. And what that means that they have now is big advantages in incumbency and scale. It's not necessary that China mine the most titanium dioxide. They do, but they have more processing capacity to make pigment from it than they mine. It's the fact that they're then importing from dig and ship operations around the world because the West, broadly speaking, were willing to say, we don't want to deal with the environmental ramifications of this and the expense of doing this. We can do it cheaper overseas and don't have to worry about the pollution, send it elsewhere. And so now we hit this point where all of a sudden we're going, well, actually, maybe we want to control some of the process flows of these minerals. And in some respects, nations have made a rod for their own back in doing so. And that's part of the kind of incumbency that's occurred. Now, if we want to onshore some of these processes, I want to say it's more than just from a geopolitical angle. That is certainly a factor in government. We can't deny that. But there are significant economic benefits to doing so if we do it right. As a rule of thumb, very broad rule of thumb, about 2/3 of profit from a final product material is in its refining. It's not in its mining. Add to that, you've got all the revenue that's associated with upgrading these materials. If you look at the titanium process chain, when you go from an ilmenite concentrate up to a final titanium metal, multiple orders of magnitude more valuable material. Now, a lot of that is expense in refining it. It's an expensive process to refine, but that comes as local potential revenue for refining plants. So onshoring refining would capture much more value in New Zealand than dig and ship export royalties alone. You know, export royalties, it's about 1% of mineral revenue, whereas actually if you start refining, you suddenly generate an awful lot more local revenue. I also make the argument that there is something beyond the economics and beyond the basic geopolitics, that actually there's a moral angle to this as well, an ethical angle. If we go back to that graph that I had earlier that showed where harms are occurring in the process chain, if all you're doing is mining something locally, you can effectively say that all of the other environmental impacts are being offshored. You're offshoring the environmental impacts and the potential harms associated with this. And that means that we're saying, yeah, we're happy to dig these rocks. Yeah, there's a bit of damage that happens there, but not too much. Offshore it, let someone else deal with it. And that doesn't feel like a very New Zealand thing to do. It doesn't feel like the kind of argument we should be having to say, we don't really care about this. Now, it's important to say this is absolutely not an argument in favour of relaxing environmental regulations so that we can onshore a dirty process and deal with the emissions ourselves. What we need to do is design clean, economically viable processes to enable the onshoring of refining. If you want to adapt refining to New Zealand, 2 core principles to try and follow. First, and perhaps very obvious one, is zero CO2 emissions. You should try and design your processes so that there are no direct CO2 emissions. Find a way of getting rid of carbon in your process. This is the carbon spot price, but that's not labelled properly on the graph. The second aspect is zero liquid discharge. We care about our waterways in this country for a very good reason. We shouldn't be letting contaminated wastewater leave our processes. We should try and recycle every drop of wastewater. And if that means that you have to spend money doing so, so be it. Because if you don't meet these constraints, either you fundamentally can't be consented. Almost all processes in New Zealand are zero liquid discharge consents. That even includes big mines like Macraes in Oceana Gold in Aotearoa. Or you're fundamentally going to hit uneconomic remediation costs. So that could be carbon capture, uptake of storage, which, personal opinion, is a bit of a white elephant. Emissions trading offsets, which can be quite expensive. Why not just not emit the CO2 in the first place? or desalination and evaporation of your wastewater to get solid waste. And that's a lot of energy involved in doing that. So how do we apply these principles to New Zealand? Well, I'm going to briefly talk about the three most significant refineries in New Zealand. Is our Oceana Gold Macraes, Rio Tinto's New Zealand aluminium smelter, Tiwai Point, and New Zealand Steel Glenbrook. And I'll start with Glenbrook because I think this is a really nice case for science for public good. As has been mentioned, we produce our own steel. We produce that from iron sand, and it's through government-funded R&D, research and development, that the process to do this was developed. Because again, unique mineralogy, you can't just throw our iron sand in a blast furnace. It will kill your blast furnace. So we had to develop our own process where you actually split the chemical step, where you're stripping all the oxygen off, and the melting step. So it's a two-step process, but it is still carbothermic. It's still relying on coal for direct reduction to pull the oxygen off. So how do you decarbonize this when New Zealand Steel as a company are New Zealand's 8th largest CO2 emitter? Glenbrook as a site is almost certainly the single largest CO2 source in North New Zealand. Well, one option is actually to just eliminate carbon. And it is the best option to follow. Carbon capture and storage is an incredibly complex process. If you can just substitute your carbon with something else, in this case, hydrogen, all of a sudden you're not emitting CO2. Trouble is, if you try and do this in a blast furnace, you've gone from a reaction that produces heat, it's exothermic, your carbon reduction, to a hydrogen process that actually requires heat. All of a sudden, you've got to try and keep your blast furnace really hot so you can actually melt your material at the bottom. But hey, we're ahead of the game. New Zealand Steel already split your reduction and your melting. So all you've got to do is substitute this kiln process up the top right and just supply a bit more heat to that. And the melter just behaves as it already has. You're just substituting one piece of equipment. And that's something we've been working on for the past 6-7 years, and we'll be working on into the future as well, to develop processes so you can produce steel, produce iron in a zero CO2 process. And on top of that, we also look at some of the co-products that are associated with iron sand. Again, vanadium's come up already. Actually, can we refine vanadium in New Zealand if we are digging this material up? One of the routes we've done for this, I mentioned earlier that blast furnaces were about 90% of global iron making. The other 10% is actually a gas-based process where you feed carbon monoxide into a bunch of pellets. Still produces a load of CO2. So we've developed our own reactor where you do a similar process, but with hydrogen instead. And we can go through and get to 95% metal. It looks a little bit boring what comes out the bottom. It's just pellets. It looks the same as it went in. I promise you, we have taken the oxygen off. And we can prove it because we can go and melt it. So I went to some collaborators over at Newcastle University in Australia and melted it down to a solid ingot. So we have been able to produce, a kilo-sized chunk of 100% green CO2-free iron in New Zealand. And this kind of facility is unique in New Zealand and indeed in the Southern Hemisphere. But pelletizing, turning all your iron sand into pellets, it's a bit of a faff. Could we just directly process as the way New Zealand Steel do? They just put sand and coal into one reactor. Could we put sand and hydrogen into one reactor and just let it do its business? And it turns out you can. Hydrogen in the bottom, bit of leftover hydrogen and water out the top. Do this at 800 degrees or so. So make sure you don't have any oxygen because hydrogen does like to go pop. And we actually benefit from the unique characteristics of New Zealand's iron sand. The titanium that's present in iron sand is part of the problem in a blast furnace, but for us, it actually benefits us. It means that our particles don't stick together as they turn into metal, and we can do in quite literally minutes what takes 10, 14 hours in a kiln. So all of a sudden, you've got this process that might be applicable. But it's all well and good talking about all this wonderful laboratory stuff. Is it actually applicable to the real world? Because to get from 10 kilos an hour to 100 tons per hour in a process plant is a big gap. And you've got to prove these technologies at scale. There is a bit of a valley of death at the pilot plant scale that you see. And very proud to say that we do actually have a startup that is spinning out of our research group called Colbeck. Had some recent interviews on RNZ who are actually looking at how this could be deployed at pilot plant scale and potentially create a pathway for the decarbonisation of steelmaking in New Zealand and potentially abroad as well. But there's more than just iron and steel in your iron sand. Vanadium was one of the drivers that TTR would often claim was driving their planned mining. But what do we actually do with vanadium? Why do we care about it? It has a lot of applications, but we don't refine it in New Zealand currently. So they would have been digging this and then probably shipping it overseas to get refined. And I don't see how that solves the critical mineral problem of control of supply chain. But New Zealand Steel themselves do actually produce about 1 to 1.5% of global vanadium supply. That is actually quite a significant fraction as a slag that gets sent overseas, and you're getting about $1 a kilo for it. If we were able to do just one step on the process chain to get up to vanadium pentoxide, all of a sudden it's $20 a kilo. So it's a real uplift in the potential value that you've got here. So why don't we do this? Well, part of the reason is the historic processing for vanadium. It requires a lot of sodium, and then you leach all of that material out, and you produce immense amounts of saline wastewater. You fundamentally can't do that in New Zealand. We cannot discharge that level of waste and the potential toxic byproducts that come in it. So, well, we had to think about the chemistry, and we found that actually, swap sodium for calcium, you no longer have your salty wastewater problem, and you can actually leach this in a domestic soda stream. Yes, this sits in our lab. Yes, it's very clearly labeled that it is not for human consumption. It's not pineapple soda. It's very toxic, in fact, but you can do this with a very benign set of processes, and we can then actually demonstrate that this could be completely a zero liquid discharge. We can recycle the water from this process, recycle the CO2 from the carbonated water, recarbonate, and just complete a completely circle loop. And this is the kind of process that we could look at applying in New Zealand. I'll move on from iron sand now to talk about very big mine. If anyone's never visited the Macraes Flats, it's quite an experience. They mine 20 kilotons of ore per day at Oceana Gold Macraes, chasing about 1.6 grams per ton of gold. That grade varies over the years. And as mentioned, they refine to gold doré on site, co-located refinery, and they're producing this intermediate material. But they don't produce anything else. They are digging all these tons of gold, so, almost 100% of the rock that comes out just goes into a tailings dam. What else is in that rock? What else is in there in pursuit of that gold that we could be using if it's being dug anyway? And this has kind of been mentioned already, that you get co-located minerals. So these gold deposits are often associated with other potential critical minerals. Stibnite, historically mined at Endeavour Inlet, and scheelite, a source of tungsten, is present in the ore and the tailings at Macraes and a lot of the sites across Otago. But very, very honest about this, gold isn't always will be the economic drivers for these mines. If anyone tells you that they're opening a new gold mine because of critical minerals, they're telling you porkies. It's not true. You fundamentally could not fund one of these mines on the tungsten or the antimony content alone. But if these mines have been consented, if they are already going ahead as gold mines, and if we're digging it up, we damn well may as well get the rest of the minerals out of it. Why just let it pile up there and not extract it? So this is something that we're working on now. Again, government-funded research through an Endeavour research and development program being co-led with the University of Auckland, and they're very much focused on trying to identify how deposits form, and so you can better work out where to mine them. But our project stream is looking at, can we develop routes to refine the gold-associated antimony and tungsten in, again, clean, zero CO2, zero liquid discharge processes. Because again, if we're going to start refining these minerals here, it has to be done in a clean way that's suitable for New Zealand. Very last one I want to talk about, and this is a bit of an interesting case, is TY Point. For anyone who doesn't know, there is a very, very large aluminium smelter right at the very tip of South Island, right down in the south at TY Point. And that is not using New Zealand minerals. That is using bauxite that is imported from Australia, that's been converted to aluminium oxide to alumina in Queensland, shipped to New Zealand, and we refine it here. The reason that is happening is because TY Point is powered by a hydroelectric dam. So what you can do is, if you refine your aluminium here in New Zealand, you can say certified green, 100% green electricity being used to make this aluminium, and that does fetch a price premium. And it's an interesting question. If we did start refining minerals in New Zealand, our own, are there actually other minerals around the world that we could then refine? So instead of saying we're exporting all the downstream harms of our minerals, could we instead say, we're going to take some of the global burden and say, we are consumers of minerals, we are part of the global community, could you actually ship your minerals to us and we'll refine in a clean way that is better for the planet and remove the harms that could be happening in your economies instead? But always a caveat. Green primary aluminium smelting, as an example, it comes at a cost. The waste is notoriously unpleasant. These are the actual signs from TY Point. You don't want to get near this stuff. Don't get it wet. Don't eat it. Don't drop it anywhere. Stay the hell away from it. Now, that waste does get stored, but it does then get shipped overseas for processing. It is cleaned up in Spain. But this really, for me, emphasizes that if we're going to do refining in New Zealand of our minerals or anyone else's, we need to think about what these processes look like. What are the waste streams, and can we actually do this in a clean way if we're going to get more of that value and benefit New Zealand? So just kind of concluding remarks, mineral refining, it's multi-process, it needs energy, it needs chemistry, and its impacts are significant, both environmental and economic, and these often outweigh those of the mine themselves. Refining can be done onshore or offshore, and this is driven by economics, and it drives the criticality. The whole argument about critical minerals is not just about mine supply, it's about refining and where it happens. The future of refining in New Zealand is still to be decided. We're trying to play our part in that conversation in the years to come. The question is, are we responsible for refining what we mine and for the refining of what we consume as a nation? We need to be clear-eyed about this. We are part of the global community, and it's easy to try and wash our hands of this and say we don't want this here because it's dirty, because it's challenging. But if we're going to be relying on other people doing the dirty work for us, I think we need to be honest with ourselves about that. Thank you very much.
So many talks, they're so good. Thank you so much to the speakers in the first part of our symposium today, the 4 speakers. I've gotten 4 questions so far. Hopefully you guys have more questions for our speakers. Please go ahead and scan the code and type in any questions you have now or during the afternoon tea. I'll leave this up, especially for people online, as we go to afternoon tea. Before that, though, we have a couple of generous sponsors to our symposium today. We got funding for the refreshments from Development Studies. Are you going to speak on their behalf? Okay. Valentine is going to come and speak to you about this program, which we have within the School of Geography, Environment, and Earth Sciences, and more about what we offer within the program and just how awesome it is.
Kia ora koutou. You may have seen in the invitation we sent out that we say this event is part of the 30 years of development studies program here at Victoria University, Herenga Waka. I'm actually not supposed to do this. My senior colleague here, Sarah Kingdom. This is Sarah. Sarah Kingdom was supposed to do this, but she's not here today. She's given me something to say to you about our program. Concerns around the use of resources, governance, security, community engagement, as well as possibilities for more ethical and sustainable futures are key components of our development studies program here at the Herenga Waka. It takes us into our teaching, research, and engagement. And as we reach 30 years of the establishment of this program here, we also celebrate the works of hundreds of our graduates who are influencing equitable and sustainable change around the world in organizations like the UN, the Asian Development Bank, Oxfam, and Anglican missions. In Aotearoa here, we value alumni partnership in government agencies, NGOs, councils, and community organizations. We have recently revised our suite of postgraduate degree programs to offer coursework through thought options for professionals wanting to sharpen their analytical skills and connect with best practice in community engagement and social action. More research-intensive pathways leading to masters and PhDs have our students working across the Asia Pacific, Latin America, and Africa. If you have been provoked, challenged, or called by any of the korero today, Catherine McKinnon, who was here earlier on, is our postgraduate coordinator and would love to hear from you to discuss your future study options. In the meantime, we trust that you leave this symposium informed, enriched, and inspired to take action. We hope you also feel more connected to our program, our school, and the university broadly. There will be more events hosted by the Development Studies program throughout this anniversary year. So please look out for those and consider joining us again. we look forward to welcoming you back to our school and to the activities we have for this year. Thank you very much.
We also have, we don't have a slide for them, but we do have a banner. We also received generous support from AusIMM, the Australian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. They funded many of our speakers' participation, actually. And we have a representative here with us today to speak to you about, no? Oh, good. Okay. Is to speak to you about the organization and what they do.
Thanks for that, and thanks for organising this. This has been great so far. So what AusIMM is it stands for Australasian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. They have had a presence in New Zealand since the 1890s, but we've had a New Zealand branch for 60 years now, which we're celebrating this year. So what do we actually do? We encourage professional and resources. How do we do that? We do that through funding things like this. We fund short courses, travelling lecture series, careers roadshows. We have scholarships. This year we had a record number of scholarships from universities around the country, and you can see that we're made up of a diverse group. We don't just have geologists, we have engineers, law professionals, geophysicists, environmental scientists, and all sorts. And that's been the diverse range of scholarships that we've handed out this year for students in masters, honours, or capstone students. We are disappointed we didn't receive any from Victoria University this year. It'd be great to see some coming through from here, but we are also very proud of our fledgling and startup student chapter, which includes students from around the country, including this university. If you want to know more, I can chat over afternoon tea.
Thank you so much again to our two generous sponsors, the Development Studies Program and AusIMM. Now we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, so that will give you some time to think up some questions for our panel. And as well, we have afternoon tea. It's being set up outside right now. It was due to start at 3. But I have heard some setting up going on. So please take this time to enjoy some refreshments, enjoy some speaking to one another and the speakers, thinking up some questions for our panel, and we will reconvene promptly at 3:30 with our final speaker, Sefton Darby, who will again pick up on discussing the role of mining in New Zealand society and geopolitical context for it. Thanks so much for your participation thus far.
Was this presentation?
Got lost.
Sefton is the beginning here.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks everyone for returning for the final bit of the symposium. Our final speaker is Sefton Darby. He is an independent consultant from Sydney. He's flown over to New Zealand just for this symposium. Also, his parents live on the Kapiti Coast. Sorry, Sefton. He's going to speak. He's an expert in the geopolitics of mining. He's actually written a book on it, on the geopolitics of mining in New Zealand. and he's here to present an inspired analysis of the role of mining in New Zealand society and why everyone has a right to be angry. Thank you very much.
Yes. Yeah, so thanks for that. I am the 98% of the carbon impact of this entire symposium. I'm going to start off with a story which kind of gets to the conversations around social license. So about 13 years ago, I was starting in what ended up being a quite ill-fated career as the National Manager of Minerals at MB. There's a couple of the people who I was working alongside with at that time in the room who knew that I was not a happy chap at the time. And as part of my role, I would go out and I'd meet with mining companies. And I was one day invited to go and meet a mining company with an office not far from here. It was either on the terrace or on Lambton Quay, one or the other. And I thought, okay, yep, I'll go and talk to the company. And I walked into a very plush office and there were rows of computers and, rows of geologists down here and rows of mining engineers down here doing mine design and kind of rows of accountants crunching the figure. And it was all this bustling hive of activity. And I said to them, so where's the environmental and the social team? They kind of gave me this slightly kind of puzzled look. And then they kind of ushered me to the back corner where, no natural light came into the room and introduced me to one environmental person and one person who had just been hired to try and attempt to do EU engagement. And I walked out of that room and I thought, oh, these guys are screwed. Because all of the resourcing was on the engineering and it was on the geology and was on the finances. And that company was Transtasman Resources. And so for those who have been in the fight for a long time, as you have been, I can remember thinking there is a fundamental step that has not happened here, or multiple fundamental steps that have not happened here very, very, very early on in the process. And that was obvious to me as a regulator around the absence of consultation, just even an absence of a relationship at such an early stage. And I'm going to be diving into that a bit today. Because I've got the vague title of independent consultant, I'll just kind of give a bit of background. I've probably spent about a third of my life working for government, about a third of my life working in kind of the private sector, including the mining industry, and about a third of my life working for various NGOs and think tanks. Probably much to the concern of our sponsors at AusIMM, I think I worked out that I'm also the only person here who's actually worked at a mine site, and that's weird because I've got 2 arts degrees. So I'm going to dive on in. This is my rough structure. I'm going to quickly run through a bit of analysis around, well, what's so critical about critical minerals. I'm then going to go and look at the structure of the mining industry. And there's a really big structural issue, which I think is driving a lot of the problems in terms of the ability to actually get mines up and running. And it's driving an awful lot of the argument and dispute that happens, not just here, but actually globally. It's a problem I see everywhere. Section 3, I'm right, you're wrong, is my code for let's talk about the social license debate and what are the things that actually drive or destroy community trust in mining projects. And then I'm going to end with some conclusions, which I've just put down as the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. My first motivation, this is probably the first press conference I ever did in my life 20 years ago. So my first motivation is to not look out in the front row and see this. This was in Kazakhstan about 20 years ago, and it goes to where I started my career. Links to the people who just paid for your coffee and your biscuits, which is I actually started in international development. And I spent an awful lot of time in Central Asia and West Africa and Southeast Asia dealing with corruption in the mining industry and the oil industry. I put this photo up because one of the kind team at the British Embassy in Almaty at the time took a photo of me giving my first ever press conference. And you can see I've managed to send 2 people to sleep. And she's just lost the will to live. So my test on this presentation is if I can look out on you all and not have this, I might have won. Motivation number two, and as was alluded, so I went from working in kind of aid and development in some very challenging jurisdictions, seeing, some of the worst that the industry could really serve up. And then I thought, I've been kind of flying around the world. I've been advising ministers in various countries, and I've never actually worked at a mine. I should go and work at a mine site. And I ended up working at the Waihi gold mine for a couple of years as manager of external affairs, and it was the hardest job I've ever done in my life. My mum lived an hour up the road, and Thames was a paid-up member of the Green Party in Coromandel. It was a daily personal conversation, and the people who you were impacting with, on a daily basis were in the same supermarket as you. It was by far and away the hardest job. And then after that came to MB and had a very unhappy kind of brief career as a regulator. And after that, I kind of went, God, I'm really frustrated with my government kind of approach on mining. I'm really frustrated with my NGO approach on mining. I'm really frustrated with the company experience. And I wrote this book, which attempted to kind of square all of them away. And still available as an ebook if you want to send yourself to sleep tonight. And about 2 days after it was published, there was this furious review from Catherine Delahunty, then a Green Party MP, continues to be deeply involved in the protection of the Coromandel, long, deep, important roots in the Coromandel. So one of the most important advocates for conservation in the Coromandel. And it was if anybody's read it, just kind of tore me to pieces in many different ways in terms of the book that I'd written, having essentially been a kind of a cozying up to industry explanation of the issues. And about 2 days after that, my publisher sent me this handwritten letter that had arrived from the West Coast, which accused me of being the most anti-industry writer that they had ever come across. And almost a direct quote that if I ever dared set foot on the West Coast ever again, I better watch out. I'm pleased to report that I most recently went to the West Coast at end of October last year, and somehow made it out alive. But it was a bit odd, right, to kind of try and write an attempt at what's going on here with all of this argument. And that's where the title of the presentation came from. Everyone is angry around here, or he's kind of right. To have kind of like, I don't know, am I a pro-industry kind of advocate, or am I the worst thing that's ever happened to industry? And I kind of seem to have existed in that space ever since. Critical minerals. This has been very well covered ground by previous presentations, but the future demand for critical minerals is stark. If you want 350 pages of graphs, I can commend to you the International Energy Agency's Critical Minerals Outlook, where they look at the future demands for key critical minerals under different climate change scenarios. So if we are going to make particular transitions to renewable energy, and electrification of transport, for example, these are the kind of growth in production that's going to be required across elements such as copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, rare earths. So there's some really, really good mapping of future kind of global demand linked to different kind of climate change scenarios. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, here's mining as a percentage of GDP over the past 25 years. Shane Jones will tell you that it was the last Labor government that destroyed mining in New Zealand, which he was part of for half the time. Actually, it was, this is the key English government. There are people in the room who suffered the pain, Simon. This is Simon's pain here. Where there was a dramatic slump here. This is when solid energy went bust, where the price of gold went down, and it was post-Schedule 4 debate, and everything got excruciatingly hard. Investment dried up. But if you want to look at the single biggest drop in the New Zealand mining industry, it has ironically been under a centre-right government rather than a centre-left government. By way of comparison, the EU averages about 0.4% of GDP, so even kind of lower than that. Australia, about 10% of GDP. If you throw in services and that wider network of industry that Glenn talked about, you kind of get up to about 13, 14% of GDP. But it's fair to say it's been a pretty rocky road. Meanwhile, and kind of Morgan alluded to this in his presentation, that the consumption goes on and on and on. So this is what happens when you take some big figures out of the US Geological Service, the survey around global production, and then you divide it by the world population and map it out. So this is the per capita use, or per capita production, sorry, of pig iron since 1910, I think. So here you see the end of World War II. This is post-World War II industrialization. This is the oil crisis. This is Reaganomics working out really well in the 80s, and this is the Chinese economic miracle here in terms of industrialization. So, but to give you a rough idea, 1910, 40 kilos of pig iron production per person. We're now up to about 160. I think this goes up just to the start of COVID, so there's a little dip kind of off the edge of the graph. So like I did a lot of history at university. I'm really interested in kind of long-term trends. And so when I think about what's going on in the minerals debate, like, well, what is the trend? And the trend is pretty stark over a 100-year period in terms of how much production is happening. Same with copper. This is a kilograms per person measure since 1900. And then there's really only a good data set in terms of lithium for the past 20 years. But look, there's where all your EVs come from. This is the past 20 years of per capita kind of lithium production. And it's pretty stark. And so there are, and I think Morgan's right to raise it, some really interesting challenges around us as an advanced economy about where are we positioning New Zealand in this global trend of massive escalation and massive industrialization, and realizing that many countries have yet to go through that industrialization process, which is why these lines continue to go starkly upwards. And as I said, partly driven by industrialization, partly driven by global population increase. So global population increase, like the growth rates peaked in the late 1960s. So global population is still going up, but not at a fast rate. But we've still added 2 billion people in the past 25 years. Like it's you know, and if you add 2 billion people with that amount of per capita kind of production, like it just adds and adds and adds. So this is, anything we think about this is really turning a massive, gigantic super tanker of patterns of industrialization, patterns of global population growth. And it's going to take a long time on a global level for that to change. And so we arrive at critical minerals. There's a large conference that happens every year in Australia called IMARC. It's kind of one of the 3 big global mining conferences. And every year people say, oh, you know, kind of the mining industry rebrands itself as something. And so for a weird period, they all decided they were technology companies. And then for a while, they all decided that they were renewable energy companies. And now every single mining company is a critical minerals company of some sort. But it's really important that we unpick those definitions of criticality. So scarcity of global supply, if we look at copper, there's massive concerns that they're just, you know, copper is integral to every element of the electrification of modern life. And our ability to find new deposits of copper are just not there at the moment. So there are an awful lot of interesting renewable energy and electrification strategies from governments around the world, which are running hard up against a very long-term decline in grade, and the fact that those deposits are getting more remote, deeper, scarcer, harder to extract. Increases in global demand, which I've shown you through graphs. Domestic economic vulnerability. You know, particular countries have vulnerability to particular kind of shocks. I'm kind of often surprised that in the context of New Zealand, nobody has talked about how we are screwed if Morocco has a war. Like, because Morocco produces, I think, 55% of rock phosphate in the world, and we are a massive industrial agricultural producer. So certain countries will have huge economic vulnerability. A lot of what is driving American rhetoric is the links to what Glenn talked about, which is the link to the defence industry, which possibly, and the only time I'm ever going to agree with Pete Hegseth on something, is, let's be blunt, it's weapons production. And there is a good chunk, there's a really good article you put me onto, which goes through and maps critical minerals production to the weapons industry. So let's call it the weapons industry because that's what it is. And that's the kind of stuff that actually is heavily driving an awful lot of the anxiety out of the Americans. Energy transition vulnerability, as I said, huge challenges around whether that transition is possible in the absence of them. And then geopolitical risks from the concentration of supply. So where you get specific countries where either the mining is very concentrated. So I've mentioned Morocco. Australia, I think, produces more than half of mined lithium at the moment, but that will change over the coming years. And China has a huge, huge amount of concentration, both in the refining and in the actual production. So it's important to understand these things because criticality is not just we don't have enough of it. It's specific vulnerabilities to specific economies, and it's specific security vulnerabilities and energy transition vulnerabilities. And it's important to unpick that because I feel like, I mean, the idea that Donald Trump cares about the energy transition, like every single other policy signal that that guy has sent has not been a pro-energy transition signal. He's really, really focused on this. Which makes me think, well, what can you do to intervene? What can you do to address criticality? So increased exploration expenditure to try and find and understand some of the geology better than we currently understand it, direct investments in processing kind of technologies, and something which I think has been, it's not missing in New Zealand, but missing in a lot of countries and kind of really struggling with, is that we often have incredibly poor public science around environmental and social impacts. Or what we do is we discover the environmental and the social impacts only at the point that we're going through a consenting process, even though the project may have been going for 20 years of exploration or prospecting. And then finally, somebody kind of goes, right, I'm at that stage, I finally want to build something and I'm going to commission a bunch of studies, which then eventually reveal massive sensitivities, massive cultural sensitivities. And they could have known this 20 years ago. They could have found out that that area has a vital history for local iwi. They could have found this out through really good public science around biodiversity. I remember talking to one of the conservators up in Northland at the time, this was 10, 15 years ago, and he made this point around the strong correlation between economic development and biodiversity in New Zealand. Because what he was saying is the only time anybody could afford to do really in-depth biodiversity surveys was when they finally had a project they wanted to set up and run. Now, that's actually a failure to fund public science. And one of my big pushes would be if you wanted to address criticality. But there's one massive intervention that we could all make right now that would wipe out most of the criticality. Anybody want to guess what we could do right now to stop critical minerals from being critical? Because we've fallen into this argument that critical minerals is like shouting and urgent and we all have to deal with it right now. The biggest intervention I'd make is don't start a trade war with China. And it sounds like a really flippant point, but I'm amazed that in the past 2 years, the entire global debate has shifted to this idea of increased defence spending. We're going to be in a conflictual relationship. There's going to be a war coming, so we've got to secure our supply chains. And I'm sorry, but this started with some really dumb trade policy from the Americans. So in terms of policy around critical minerals, the single most important policy that is on the table for New Zealand and other countries is foreign policy and trade policy and what our relationships are, because it doesn't have to be critical. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum kind of global security, global geopolitics conversation. And this has just got lost. Everybody's talking about critical minerals as if it's the end of the world, and it wasn't the case 2 or 3 years ago. The next thing I want to talk about is just how the mining industry works a bit. And I didn't understand this for a really long time, which is there are a lot of companies calling themselves mining companies, and most of them are not mining companies. A lot of them, most of them, are actually exploration companies. And my analogy here is that they actually are very similar to tech startups. And I can talk about this because I've just worked in a tech startup for the past 4.5 years. So you don't really hear about them until they suddenly become famous. They're kind of a massive speculative bet based on a lot of data. And the only thing the market rewards them for, the only thing the Toronto Stock Exchange and the Australian Stock Exchange primarily rewards them for, is getting more data. That is all they get rewarded for. It is often run by a tiny number of people. The vast majority of them will fail. There were some great stats in Matt's presentation around that kind of 1,000 down to one kind of funnel that he showed. And they are built not to run mines. They are built for somebody else to buy them, just like tech startups. And because of that, most of them go, environmental and social impacts are somebody else's problem. Mining companies, on the other hand, and this has become more and more extreme over the past 10, 20 years, where the mining companies have wanted to become more and more financialized and boring. They want to be part of your pension fund. They want to deliver a dividend stream over 30 years. They don't want, they're trying to build up a portfolio of assets that deals with these massive ups and downs that Glenn was showing you. So they're enormous. They want to be out of sight. They want to be boring. They have increasingly hived off basically their exploration business, so their R&D business, to these little companies. And the environmental and social approach is wildly variable. So I have had some of these companies as clients over the years, and some have been exceptional. And I say exceptional not just in the context of the mining industry, exceptional in any industry in terms of their approach to social and environmental impacts. And some have been aggressively awful. And so there is a wide variety of behaviour by the multinationals in this front. So that's the scorecard. Tiny, extreme risk on the exploration side. Most of the time you don't hear about them. Then you'll hear a huge amount when they're finally trying to get funding. So you'll often hear massive overstatement from the exploration company. Negative revenue. These guys are burning cash for often decades. And they are burning cash, hoping that they will be one of the tiny number that succeed and get acquired by a larger company. Or they get a project up and running that can then sell. And how this plays out is that you have the exploration companies primarily here, and then development, production, processing. And then I'm going to introduce a highly scientific moment here, which is here lies the zone of heat, light, anger, and bullshitification. And there's this, and this is one of our fundamental problems, not just in New Zealand, but globally, that we have very small, very high risk, rewarded almost entirely only for acquiring more and more geological data, not rewarded. This is a fundamental market problem. This is a problem in Toronto. This is a problem in Australia. They are not rewarded for getting social and environmental data. And then suddenly they put a mining permit application in, or they put an EPA permit application in, or they put a fast track permit application in, and it all blows up. And those companies are often just not equipped. They're not bad people. They've just not got the right people to deal with this. They haven't got executives who know about this. Now, I would argue that's actually stupid. Were they trying to build a mine, or were they just drilling more and more holes? They need a more diverse skill set. But there's often really not a diverse skill set, and there's often a real failure over 10, 12, 15 years to even do the work, to even get out on the ground and meet people. And actually the regulators, local councils, have not required them to, because they're just kind of going, oh, you're going to put a drill rig here for 4 weeks. You're not going to have much to an impact. You're going to drill a hole, you're going to fill it back in, and then we won't see you for 2 years. Like, from a regulatory point of view, it's incredibly low impact in an awful lot of this. And so it doesn't trigger anything in the district plan or the regional plan. And these kind of going, well, we don't need to be visible, and we're kind of shy retiring geologists. We don't really want to be visible. And we don't want to be visible because there's a 999 in 1,000 chance that this is not going to turn into anything. But this is where a huge amount of the problem comes, is that inability to consider environmental, social, cultural issues here rather than here. And the skill set in the industry is not helping them. Which is my segue into I'm right, you're wrong, or let's talk about social license. So here's a typical New Zealand model of project acceptance rejection. You start by communicating vast amounts about how wonderful your project is and how amazing your company is. You massively talk up the project benefits, and you say everybody's going to be jobs for everyone and money for everyone, and the numbers are stupendous. You gently acknowledge there might be some subtraction for project impacts, and then at the end of this equation, you either get project acceptance or project rejection. This is normally done, describe the project as if you're selling it to yourself rather than to the wider world, overstate these, understate these. And if it gets rejected, tell everybody the law's wrong, which is a part of the history of the New Zealand mining industry. And because I have no mining clients in New Zealand, they're all in Australia, I'm just going to be really blunt. Like, New Zealand's 20 years behind in this. I hate to be the person who comes over from Sydney and tells you that you're 20 years behind the Australians, but you are when it comes to this. The sophistication of data and understanding of cultural and social and environmental impacts and how to work with communities. There are entire research centres in Australian universities dedicated to understanding this. Centre for Social Responsibility at the University of Queensland produces incredible research, often extremely critical of industry, but also working with industry. There are some incredible scientists. Deanna Kemp is one of the professors, John Owens, one of the professors. They do exceptional work. And so CSIRO, who's actually the government research organisation, have done 3 surveys over the past decade, 20,000 participants, trying to understand what makes or breaks trust between communities and mining companies. And the reason I care about this, I worked in the company that got spun out of this. So this is the tech startup I've been working with. And this is all online. There's a full report online. There's a data dashboard online. You can go and dig into any single indicator. It's really, really good data set of social data designed by social psychologists, and then really intense modelling of that data by a data science team. And then they produce these kind of diagrams, which I'm not going to try and explain too hard, but broadly the research is the biggest driver of social license. So this is an industry-wide survey. I've seen 40 of these for an individual site survey. An individual site might be for power lines, might be for renewables, might be for mines. And heavily, again and again and again, trust comes out as the biggest driver of acceptance. And then you kind of go, and in this case, this is a industry-wide thing, so you've kind of got this big driver of benefits outweighs costs. But interestingly, trust is still bigger than contribution to the Australian economy. It's bigger than minerals necessary for the for renewable transition. And then you kind of go and look at what are the factors that drive trust. And the public debate here is, oh, well, it's lots of benefits and jobs, isn't it? Actually, it's not. I can remember stacking up 37 of these models and looking at the 5 biggest drivers of trust across multiple industries in Australia. And again and again and again, the top 2 ones were procedural fairness and the quality of regulation by government. And I'm going to dive into those because it's going to show that the pathway that we are currently on in New Zealand is not particularly helpful. This is another model, shows you that trust is kind of the foundation rather than the end point. This is like my 2-year-old threw spaghetti at the wall, but this is hot off the press from ANU, which is another great piece of kind of modelling, but again shows trust and government accountability, quality of engagement and community trust are the key drivers around infrastructure development. And so what do we mean by trust? Broadly, there are 2 chunks around trust. There is integrity-based elements to it, which is that the company or the outgroup, as it here, adheres to a set of principles, and secondly, that there's a competence base, that you actually believe that they will be good at their jobs. So what do we mean about being good at regulation? So across those 37 models that I've stacked up, where this was either the first or the second biggest driver of community trust, communities are more accepting of mining activity or infrastructure activity if they believe that it is well regulated. That if something goes wrong, the government will notice and do something about it, that there are consequences for getting things wrong. And so project acceptance necessarily suffers if people do not think that the government can be trusted to properly govern and regulate, which is a bit of a problem if you're running around the country saying fast track is about getting rid of regulations. And so fast track number 1 is a pretty direct impact on regulation driving trust. And it's a pretty direct challenge to procedural fairness. Procedural fairness is basically accountability. Did the company proactively engage? Did they listen to concerns? Did they act on what they heard? So not just, oh, I consulted, I heard you, now I'm just going to crumple it up and throw it in the bin. but actually did they address what they heard and change their project as a result, which I've seen many very good operators do. But again, if you're running in a deregulatory environment in which you're saying regulation's stupid and we want to do everything fast, and part of doing things fast is we don't want to actually hear from people and change projects as a result of what we hear, then actually that's going to smash trust. So there's a weird thing going on in New Zealand and a number of countries where somebody has decided that the problem with getting mines or infrastructure up and running is that there's too much community voice and there's too much regulation. And actually the research based on tens of thousands of survey responses is actually regulation and accountability to people drives trust, and trust drives acceptance in projects. So we've got the model wrong. And so I don't think this is going to end well for this government. It's not going to end well for several governments. It's fast track is great if you want to do a deal. If you want to sell your project from person A to person B, awesome. But I don't think it's going to create industries or renewable energy projects that are going to survive 20, 30 years. Elsewhere in those kind of models, you do see environmental impacts, benefits, engagement, but interestingly, often much lower down the order. And I've been given the 2-minute warning, so I'm not going to stay here long. I'm going to get to some conclusions. It's the end of Where We Know, World as We Know It, and I feel fine. 10 points to anybody who's old enough to understand the music reference. So I'm the Aussie import. So I'm from a medium-sized country, mid-sized population, very low population density, very high levels of Human Development Index rankings, very high levels of GDP wealth, very high levels of industrialisation, and quite significant pollution. Except I'm not talking about Australia, I'm talking about New Zealand. I'm struck in the policy debate at the lack of ambition around what New Zealand can be. And a lot of it is when you hear politicians going, oh, we're just a little country. We're just that big. We're just small. Oh, we're not very rich. Oh, we're only X% of global production or Y% of carbon emissions, or, you know, we're just tiny. That is a politician saying, I can't be asked. Look for that signal and challenge it when you hear it. Because when you stack New Zealand up on all of these indicators against the 200 countries in the world, we are a mid-sized, mid-population, extremely developed, extremely rich. And it's not to say there is not poverty in New Zealand, but it's just saying when you stack New Zealand up against 200 other countries, and very high levels of industrialisation with very significant pollution. I'm really surprised that Glenn and I wrote an article for the Herald recently, and we kind of had a line in there about, you know, New Zealand has a massive agricultural system which has been responsible and continues to be responsible for the overwhelming majority of our climate change emissions, has devastated our waterways, and yet seemingly gets a massive free pass. That is an industrialized system. It is a factory that stretches the length of this country, and we don't talk about it. And it's really interesting. And I put that up there because we don't seem to perceive ourselves as an industrialized country. We don't perceive ourselves as a big country. We are. So I think, I know it's a bit kind of philosophical, but I think the starting point on conversations around mining, or indeed any other sustainable development use, has to be that. If you thought that was waffly, this is really waffly. GDP is just like a really shit measure. And when you hear about all of the different regulations and all of the different approaches, and this version of the RMA and this version of the RMA, and when we're going to merge government parts together, they are all attempts to deal with non-economic measures to either prioritise or deprioritise them. But it ignores well-being. It measures and rewards destructive activity. I can remember Bill English, when he was finance minister, he had this great line. He'd point out and say, well, and it's kind of interesting, it came from Bill English, right? He'd say, you know, well, GDP growth is not everything. Otherwise, the Christchurch earthquakes would have been awesome, because there was a really big kind of uptick in growth after the Christchurch earthquakes. There is going to be a massive uptick in growth in Ukraine if that war ever ends. Is that an excellent outcome? No, it's not. I have a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, and an 89-year-old father. Half of my economic output is not measured at the moment, because I live half of my life in the care industry at the moment. It ignores the depletion of natural asset, ignores income distribution. So when I think where is the thing fundamentally going wrong, it is going wrong in the measurement. And again, when we have governments who are saying, actually, we're going to deprioritize all of the other stuff, and we're going to try and handle the other stuff through regulation or through structures or through bureaucratic processes, what they're actually saying is GDP doesn't work, but we're just going to focus on that dollar figure bit, and we're going to try and regulate the other bits and not count them. The third bit, I wish we could have regulatory reform, and this is from a report I was doing recently for some NGOs in the US. At the moment, our challenge in many industries, but particularly mining, is that the regulators and the community and the companies, we have these big set piece regulatory processes at the point of a mining permit application. Whereas actually we could have been talking about environmental and social and economic impacts 10, 20 years ago. We could have been knocking out bits of the project that cause undue harm much earlier. And also, I've got it afterwards, one of the kind of the great unknown things in the minerals permit queue at MB is the vast number of change applications that are in the system, which is you get a mining permit and then you change the mine and you change the mine and you change the mine and you change the mine. I was working with a mining company that had put through 15 substantial modifications to their mine in 16 years. And a lot of those just floated below the surface. And there was very little community involvement and very little kind of focus until it blew up. I was there because it blew up. I'm the person you call when your project blows up. So there needs to be a fundamental challenge around how do we get to a regulatory system which addresses that these impacts can be identified earlier, that they continue after the permitting decision. And how do we address the fact that if we look at the fast track processes in mining in New Zealand at the moment, or any regulatory process around mining in New Zealand at the moment, they are mainly trying to regulate a tech startup. They're not trying to regulate a mining company. Is that 2 minutes or minus 2 minutes? It's minus 2 minutes. Jeez. So the regulatory regime doesn't work because we're trying to regulate tech startups as if they're mining companies. Royalties, we've got the worst royalties regime in the world. Glenn's hinted at one part, which is what the quantum is. The other part is New Zealand is almost entirely unique in that Wellington keeps all the royalties. That's bad. And the massive politicization of the fast track process. My final one, here's a really long quote from Kemp and Owen, the researchers at the University of Queensland. Let's just defund the industrial PR complex. Like most of the consideration and the attempt to get projects over the line is primarily being run by tech startups who then bring in lawyers and comms people at the very end. And it does not build trust. That's me at minus 3 minutes.
That is so great. And again, thought-provoking. We're gonna just set up the panel now. The chair will be blank, and we'll have the engaged hall as well as lights on.
Okay.
You are
These all on. You should take video mode off.
Okay. Hold on. Okay.
There.
You might just use all the speaker because they can do that. So yeah, I don't have this right now.
I'll just say that on my effect on here.
Yeah. And we'll have this for let's put on the mind.
Yeah.
All right, we've got some new faces on the panel. On your right hand is Joseph Vindal, Matthew, Sefton Derby, who just presented, Graham Young, accompanying our EWE team, Chris Bombi from the Robinson Research Institute, Mike Joy from the School of Geography, Environment and Earth Sciences, and of course, Morgan Lauder, who also presented. Please, a round of applause to our panelists.
Please stop sharing.
No, it's stop sharing. No. And so we'll invite Glenn to take over. You've got the microphone. I will hand the microphone.
I've got a microphone on.
Yeah.
Right.
We want to blow up. Stop the sharing.
Stop sharing.
Stop the sharing.
Just while they get their tech sorted. I think what we'll do in terms of how long we got? 40 minutes or so, 25 minutes. I'll go first to some of the questions that were put to people and get specific responses to those. Some of them are directed, I think, at the panel as a whole, so there might be a variety of views and there might be one or two that are aimed specifically at individual people. Then I'd like to get the panelists that we haven't heard from yet to perhaps reflect on what they'd heard and any comments they have, and then open it up, if we've still got time, open it up to questions from those of you in the room, including, I think, we'll probably take questions from the virtual participants one way or the other. Caroline's looking a bit concerned. Rightio. No, that's okay. So you're privileged in the room here to be able to ask.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, first up, thank you very much for today. I've learned a lot and it's been a fantastic experience. And the other nice thing is that by being moderator, I don't have to answer any questions about my stuff, so I can throw it to these people. As an opener, and this is, I think, directed perhaps at Chris and Morgan, to what extent can we get critical minerals from old mine tailings?
You got it.
Very good question. It can be very challenging. One of the problems you've got when you're looking at mine tailings is scale and dilution. So if you imagine that you've taken a gold mine and you've mined through, 20 kilotons of rock a day, you've built up a very large amount of tailings. Now, that might mean that there's quite a lot of tungsten, for example, available in those tailings, but you've then got to move all of those kilotons of rock through to a processing plant to process them again. So it is feasible to do. One of the challenges you might face is actually how well did a company index the resource that went into those tailings? If it's not a resource that you're looking for, if, say, again, taking gold as an example, if you're a gold mining company, you care about how much gold went in the top and how much gold has come out the bottom. You're not necessarily actually accurately tracking what's in your tailings. So you almost need to actually go and do that entire process chain that Matt showed through of you've got to go and do exploration of your tailings to identify how much is there. It's not to say it's not possible. Chris might have some more comments on that.
I think I'm going to keep coming back to an important point here, which is that detail matters. Every project is different, and it depends a lot on the specific operation that you're talking about as to what has actually happened to the material that went through the mine, and then in particular through whatever happened to it in the process plant. Most process plants have multiple streams. They're actually quite complex, and there are different areas in which you end up with different streams coming through. But in the broader point, I think you were asking, which is about co-mineralization of specific critical minerals, and the gold, tungsten, antimony nexus is the obvious one. They do all come from similar geological systems, and there definitely are co-occurrences occurring through the mines. Just to finish off on that point, and just because this business about detail matters, actually, when you're on a gold mine, they have several different forms of waste stream. They have what they call waste rock, which is just big chunks of rock that they dug out of the way to get into the mine. Now, that rock may in and of itself have low grades of specific minerals in them, and there are specific examples around the country where operators are already going back into waste rock piles, because when gold is at $5,000 an ounce, material that was waste rock 10 years ago is now ore. But those waste rock piles typically are large chunks of rocks. They get regrassed and they look like a sheep paddock pretty quickly, and you don't realize they're there. And then you also have tailings, and these are typically more finely ground material. They've had the metals at least partially extracted from them at some point previously in the process, and they've then been put into what is known as a storage dam. We need to be a bit careful about that word, because the word dam conjures up a vision of sort of a large, wet reservoir full of very sloppy material. And sometimes they can be like that when they're first loaded. But over time, those storage pounds actually tend to solidify quite quickly. And so they become a pretty solid sort of dried mud / earth pile. And that's where you can often find significant mineral resources left there. But you then have to go and drill into your mud pile to find out whereabouts in that very big pile was the period when you were going through some very rich tungsten or antimony. So that whole process then becomes a sort of secondary exploration process within the mining operation. All of which is to say, it's complicated.
Okay. And it shifts, and it's different for each operation. And yes, yeah. Thank you. We have another question here that I think, Sefton, you might be in a good position to speak to this. The question comes from Catherine Dyer. What kind of transition are we planning for? What assumptions sit behind demand for critical minerals? And what challenges do you see to these assumptions? Now, anyone else on the panel could answer that, but Sefton sort of strikes me as the person who might have the first crack at it.
You're calling upon my 350-page memory of an IEA report. Yeah, so at that macro level, my understanding of those IEA projections is that they essentially map out kind of the various scenarios required to keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees, and then they look at how many, if to achieve that, you're going to have to get rid of the primary source emissions, so transport, power generation through kind of coal, gas, kind of petrol, diesel, etc. And what will you need to be able to replace that in terms of either hydro, solar, wind, rooftop solar, etc. And then what are the material inputs to then come up with that replacement generation and electricity storage. And that's effectively the scenario they're projecting that then shows you need X amount more copper, Y amount more lithium, Z amount more. So that is my rough understanding of the IEA predictions. Is that Chris, you're probably the other person who may have looked at that report?
I have. And I think if we want to talk about the single biggest challenge that's facing us from a demand perspective, it's about electrification. You need a lot more copper wire. I think the Australians were saying they were going to need another 18,000 kilometres of transmission line in order to meet their 2040 electrification targets. And that's just in Australia. You multiply that up over the world, just the sheer amount of copper and aluminium needed for transmission lines, but in and of itself is driving that market. If we look at penetration of electric vehicles, then lithium, neodymium in the motors that are in it, they're in every wheel, as well as quite a wide range of other metals. It's this diversity of metals that has changed in the last 25 years. We've gone from a metals industry where we had base metals. We had steel, zinc, aluminium, copper. That was about it. And then some specialty stuff around the edges. And now suddenly we've got this complete cornucopia of about 30 other elements which have become essential for everything from solar cells to batteries to all sorts of systems. And those supply chains are quite tied up with the supply chains for some or other companion metal, because a lot of these metals turn up in quite dilute form in the rocks and they don't turn up on their own. And so you have to have some operation that actually pays for the mine and pays for the extraction. And that's typically your dominant material. And then everything else comes along afterwards. When you then start mucking around and moving things around and changing the economics of those big base metals, you also change the production of the other systems. Vanadium is a really good example. New Zealand makes 1% of the world's vanadium pentoxide supply. It's a bit of an accident. We didn't design Glenbrook to do that. We designed Glenbrook to make steel. And then after about 8 or 9 years of it operating, the operators there realized they had this vanadium-rich slag. And so they put a very small extra operation in to make an extra slag, which now is vanadium enriched. And that is what we currently export to the rest of the world. And that's 7.5% of the world's vanadium that is not made in Russia or China. But we're about to halve the amount we're going to make because we've decided that we're going to put an electric arc furnace in to recycle steel. Now, that's great, right? We recycle steel, we reduce the carbon intensity of our steel mill, that's all wonderful. But it has this knock-on effect for the vanadium supply to the globe because vanadium is a companion metal and we're now only going to make half as much of it because we're only making half as much raw pig iron. So those sort of things are happening all over the world all the time at the point when we've got this massive demand for everything going on in the other direction.
And yeah,
sorry, the one other base assumption is that the global economy continues as currently structured, except with a different fuel source, would be the most biggest assumption.
Mike.
Would kindly request people in the audience to refrain from speaking, would have a chance to open up the floor for people to speak from the audience. Thank you.
I was just going to touch on that copper. One thing that I'm on about is that, and others have already mentioned that the ore concentration of copper is declining. We mine it all with fossil fuels. The energy return on energy invested for fossil fuels is declining. So those two things multiply together. You have to dig up more and more and more material to get the same amount of copper, and you're using an energy source that is declining and that you have to put more and more oil or fossil fuels into getting those fossil fuels. Those two things multiply together to make it ever more impossible to achieve that
issue. Yeah. It's tricky and it's complicated and it's those flow-on effects and the unintended consequences of doing one thing that can accentuate some of the other issues that we're trying to deal with. There was another question here and I'm going to actually throw this to Graham, because one of the things that came up with TTR was the opportunity cost of, if you mine the seabed, what are the other effects on other industries that some of the evidence talked about the offshore wind, but it also talked about conservation, but it also talked about fisheries as well. So are you able to speak to the opportunity cost of going ahead with the seabed mining as opposed to other things?
So generally that was quite a significant issue, especially for the community and for Ngāti Rōnui. So there's effectively the loss of opportunity is what we look at. And some of those biggest losses are in developing industry around tourism. was a significant loss for us in terms of developing our coastal resource for others to enjoy. But there was other opportunity costs in terms of conservation, preservation, and there's also opportunities lost in industry and research and across the board in terms of where you shift, I suppose, where populations might focus as well, because effectively, if you take away our fishing industry, you're removing people from communities that have existed for generations. And if they leave, they don't just cause the loss of that particular industry, they'll have a knock-on effect indirectly to that community as a whole. So it's not just an industry opportunity lost, it's a community loss as a whole. So places like Paotea, who would have potentially recreational and commercial fishery connections, if they're lost, the whole community potentially is lost and it loses part of its I suppose, itself. And so you see it in terms of things like the Paotea freezing works, which was a huge impact on Paotea in the 1983 when it closed. Then what you're just doing is causing other opportunity loss to a community that's already still suffering from what it lost then. So effectively, TTR would have caused a doubling down of effect of opportunity lost. So it's that cumulative impact of opportunity lost over a period of time. So it's not necessarily, you could say, just one thing or two things are lost. It's the cumulative impact of loss over a period of time, especially on the smaller communities that impact the interface.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on opportunity costs? We've got a couple of other questions, and then I'm going to ask Josie and Mike and Chris to comment more generally. Actually, one of them's, Sefton, you touched on it in relation to the link between critical minerals and defence. Are you able to say any more about that? And actually, I don't know if anyone else on the panel is that something that. Oh, Morgan.
No, I'm not going to attempt to have a go at what the minerals are.
Almost all of them. Unfortunately, yes. A lot of minerals are tied up to defence demand, particularly with the US demand for critical minerals. That is a key driver. You do see that with, vanadium is an example. It's used in an awful lot of high performance alloys. But there is the caveat that, this is always the difficulty, they're not just used for that. So if you take, I'm going to use vanadium just because it's a useful reference point, it's vital for high strength steel. If you add a tiny fraction, less than 1% of vanadium to our steel, you double its strength. You need half as much steel. So, for our economy, that's vital, but it also all the way goes through to a lot of the alloys that are used in aerospace, heavily tied to defense. Those are also orthopedic implant alloys. The same alloy that's in your titanium hip is the same alloy that unfortunately is going into a missile. And how you decouple that demand is very, very difficult to do at the supply side. It's not to say that defense isn't driving demand. Defense weapons, the war industry is driving it. It's certainly a factor. So yeah, there should be open conversations about that.
And then Graham and then Joseph.
Yeah, sorry, that's a really long stretch for communities to take. So often they are seen as academic debates rather than direct debates that affect that community. So if you can't get the community debate right, the ability to introduce a debate about where the mineral may eventually end up will often be lost on a community anyway. And does that community care? Because it's having to focus on what is the impact now for them. So I think there has to be a tinge of reality about having a debate about where a small percentage might end up versus if you can't get the fundamentals right with a community and the social license to extrapolate that to where that mineral might end up in a particular piece of equipment is is a sophisticated debate that if you can't get the basics right, how can you then expect the community to have that debate?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Josie Vidal and I'm the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Minerals Council. Just on the defence side, defence is a legitimate industry. And I was at a conversation a couple of weeks ago around critical minerals and relationships with some of our trading partners. And I was very impressed by a New Zealand company called Mint, who they do repurposing and recycling of all of the minerals in all of the tech. And the person, unfortunately, they couldn't get funding in New Zealand, so they're based in Sydney and Texas, but they are a New Zealand company. And the young woman running that was very quick to speak to the senior Americans there from the American government, and she wanted to have it in their Texas plant. She wanted to take all of the military waste, e-waste, and repurpose it. So these are arguments that can go in very many directions, round and round and round and round. Yeah. So that was and she was very dynamic and she was very focused and she had a great idea. And they actually went, oh, okay. And that's some young Kiwi woman who went to university somewhere here and is out there solving what are quite big, complex problems in, I think, a pretty impressive way. That's completely a sidetrack.
There's a question I'm going to put to each person along the line, I think, and we'll start with, it's one of the ones that came up here, and it's kind of, I think, central to the reason why we're having some of this debate. And that is, how can we ensure that revenue from mining better benefits Aotearoa? So we'll start with Josie and we'll go along and everyone can kick in and have a response to that.
Sure. So this is, again, a conversation that gets quite emotive because, as Matt explained to you, opening a mine in New Zealand is not for the faint-hearted. It's a long process that requires large sums of money, and those large sums of money come from offshore, because I don't know how you think we've got a medium-sized population, but we're not even the size of a small city in lots of places. So we need that money from offshore. So then there's this Then there's this belief in some quarters that that money all goes back offshore. Well, of course it doesn't. So it goes into royalties, income tax, wages, rates, everything every other company pays in New Zealand gets paid in New Zealand. Employment's here. And in the communities where there is mining, and you will know this from your time at Oceana Gold, a lot of money is put back into the community. And sure, you can say, oh, it's big corporates buying their way in. So what? Hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars actually goes into schools, sports, healthcare, all sorts of community projects, even environmental projects. So money does go back into the community. It's a high wage, highly productive sector. So those wages get spent at the local coffee shop. And in the areas where there are mining is a significant contributor to your old mate GDP. We do have to have some kind of economic measures to know where our money is going. And so I think that it's wrong to say that there isn't a contribution, both economically and socially, in the areas where there is currently mining.
I guess I'd just like to see some better statistics about where that money is going. So what actually are the royalties in cash coming to the government, and are they being distributed back to the communities? And we talk about lots of money being injected into communities when a company starts mining. What is lots of money? And is it the same in different regions? And probably got some statistics coming. Because some of that may be hearsay and that's tricky to deal with. And the other thing is putting it back into be good to see some of those royalties going back into education. I just want to pick up on something Sefton mentioned in Australia, is the attachments to the universities and studies about social and environmental studies around mining. That's not being done here, that it's missing, and I think we could really benefit from it.
Well, I couldn't.
Yeah, we've got about, and this is not everybody contributed to this, but from what we know of the mining companies pay more than $3 million a year in contributions to their local communities. Royalties are actually, again, not the figure you should be focusing on, because it is a low amount. It's the amount of corporate income tax and PAYE that is and in 2025 that was $342.5 million.
So I'd start the benefit equation at that kind of regulatory thing, which is ensuring that both the benefits and the liabilities have been appropriately costed. So that we're not just talking about the benefit side. Fox was here, who wrote some very good articles. So the environmental liabilities from some of the coal mines on the West Coast have been nationalised twice. And I know they've been nationalised because I used to sign the cheque to Solid Energy to rehabilitate the damage that had been done before the mines were corporatised in the 80s. So step one, ensure that the liabilities are costed and that there are insurance mechanisms in place in case of failure, and so that if there is a disaster, that there are financial resources there to address them. The single biggest dollar sum out the door from mining companies is wages, goods and services. So we get a bit obsessed about tax and royalties and all of that stuff. But if you want benefit in New Zealand, then some of the biggest stuff you can do is actually around skills development of local workforces. Other countries actually do condition that through local content requirements. And actually some of the big Australian miners work very, very, very hard. They have very, very, very high percentages. And in fact, in some cases, it's tied to Indigenous land use agreements around Aboriginal employment in places like the Pilbara. So biggest impact, number one, make sure as much as possible of your local workforce is actually local. And then try, and again, this is where the Australians have been very good, is ensure that as much of your supply chain is local as well. And then tax and then royalties. But we kind of forget that actually it's wages and its supply chain are the biggest dollars out the door for almost any organisation, particularly, and it's the same with the mining industry. So liabilities, wages, supply chain.
Yeah, look, we would agree the biggest benefit is probably what the community can benefit directly from them in terms of skilled labour and opportunity. We're very strong on ensuring the opportunities are there for our people to engage in these industries. Putting aside some of the environmental debate, if it's going to be there at the end of the day, we want to benefit from some of it. We've recently just done an application for a solar farm where we have an overriding a relationship agreement with the company, which is focused heavily on skills and education over the long term, over the life of the development, not just around the consenting. The consenting won't deliver that to you at all. It's often the relationship agreement now that will be the key part of where the benefit is, where, for instance, particularly iwi will benefit from that. Royalties, as I agree, I think it's a bit of a misnomer. That just goes into the consolidated account. And we've had debate for years saying we should be clipping the ticket and it should be coming back to Taranaki, given the amount of royalties generated in Taranaki. But it's probably not going to happen given the way the government's currently structured in terms of what goes into the consolidated account. So I don't think that's going to happen, but we would always argue for that as well, that royalties should come back to the place where the mineral is won from, so that the region or the district can benefit from that. So I think that's really important, but I think it's a case of a more sophisticated debate or agreement that you can achieve with companies that are in your own takiwa, your own region, and what they are achieving and what you can achieve with them. And I think it comes down to the age-old thing. Often what's good for us, like iwi, will ultimately be good for the community as a whole.
Thank you. It will come as a surprise to no one after me and Morgan already banging this drum for a while, that to hear me say that actually we're not just talking about mining. We're talking about a materials value chain that ultimately produces value-added products that we are made items. This is what defines a human civilization, is made items. And the further you move along that value chain, the more value you capture. So if we want to actually use this as a tool to grow real wages in New Zealand, ultimately we're looking at using that as a tool to grow the value of our exports from New Zealand, which means we need to move down the value chain. And we need to move as far down the value chain as we reasonably can within the confines of our own economy and within our own ability to both afford it, but also to be able to manage the environmental impact on our country. So the single biggest thing we can do around anything that's not gold, gold already has got quite a long way down the value chain. Gold doré is already about 90 to 95% of the full value of gold. So you're pretty much there. But anything else, unless you're New Zealand steel, there is scope to move down to intermediate and to metal products. And in doing that, you will increase by a factor of 5 to 10 the total value that you capture inside the New Zealand economy. And that is value that is paid to workers in New Zealand and then ultimately is paid as PAYE to the New Zealand government. 50% of total PAYE tax, total tax take in this country is from PAYE. That is where the dominant work is done in funding all of our public services, from health to police to teaching to this place. So we have to drive individual wages, and that means we need better paid wages. So that's the first thing. Second thing is infrastructure. You need persistent benefit from this. If we're digging up something that's one-off, we need to leave behind persistent benefits. And so that should come in the form of persistent infrastructure in the region of that development. Roads, power lines in particular, water treatment works, the basics of a societal civilization that comes when you have a large operation that can invest in those things. And the third thing, and I will, I think, take a slightly different view to the people on my left about royalties, is they are modest, but they are measurable, and you can tag them to do things in a way that you can't with almost anything else. So I do think that, I agree with you, Glenn, the royalty system does need a bit of a rethink. There is no reason at all why it cannot be put together in a way where at least there is a division of funds between some going to a central consolidated account and some being available to the local communities. Because if you live in a community with a local mine going on, you deserve to see some benefit and to be able to point to the new hospital that was built with funds from the mine. Then everybody in the community is benefiting and everybody understands why this is good for the nation and the region.
That speaks to social licenses as well. Just a little aside, I agree with what you're saying about value, trying to keep the value add process here. But it's interesting, the dairy industry, Fonterra has gone completely the opposite way. And it was, yeah. Anyway, Mike.
No, everyone else has covered it really well.
Similar situation here, I think. Yeah, finding ways to capture more of the value chain. It's the biggest factor, and that also ties in with the education, the additional jobs, and you've got to kind of close the loop on it. This might get me into trouble, but I think actually pushing for New Zealand ownership of these projects beyond just iwi engagement. I think it's important that iwi actually have a financial stake and communities have a financial stake in mines as well. Yes, we are a medium-sized country, and we are going to be reliant on outside investors as well. But if we can actually sustainably generate investment in New Zealand as well, I think that's how we really get the long-term benefits from this, if communities actually have an invested stake and direct financial encouragement. Yeah,
that's interesting because globally, most of my work's in other parts of the Pacific, and in many parts of the Pacific, there's a very strong nationalistic streak. Some of the biggest gold mines in the world, and in Papua New Guinea are completely 100% Papua New Guinea owned. Some of them, the Porgera gold mine, for example, is 51% national ownership, and landowners and communities have a significant share of that 51%. So it's a model that is applied elsewhere. And I know it's applied in other parts of the world too. So yes. I'm just going to, we've kind of, the panelists here have had a little bit to say, but I'd like to get Josie, Chris and Mike to comment more broadly about what they've heard today and how they, because you're coming from quite different positions, and what do you make of it, Mike?
Okay, I think that the one thing that I'm going to say that's different from what everyone else has said, which is maybe not surprising to some, is everybody just seems to be assuming that we have to keep mining, that we have to keep growing, that somehow, it's just this problem that we have of not being able to imagine a world that isn't like the world that we have today. I call it the crisis of imagination. And so everybody that's spoken today has assumed that, even though Sefton's pointed out how much the per capita growth of our consumption has gone up, Sefton, the one thing that you did a great job of putting down GDP, but the one thing GDP is good at, and as an ecologist, I can tell you, GDP is the best measure of environmental destruction that we have. So if our goal, if everybody here is thinking that the best thing we can do is to grow GDP, then you are committing suicide, because that is the trap. We have reached the limits of what the planet can absorb, what the climate can absorb, what our rivers can absorb. Sorry. So, that's my take, is that we're missing, is that the limits to growth, and that we can't keep doing what we've been doing up till now.
So I think that leads quite well actually into the main point I wanted to make, which was just to return actually to a point that we've touched on a few times, but is really important. We need to decarbonize our world. We have a world at the moment that runs still on oil and on coal. And to decarbonize the world, we have to electrify it. Once we've electrified it, we can run renewable energy and we can drive electrification of all of these technologies. But electrification requires a huge range of these new metals. So we can have an imagination of a new world, which maybe it hasn't grown from where we are. Maybe we are still looking at similar lifestyles, similar life expectancies, but it has to be different. And it has to be different because it needs to have electric vehicles in it. It needs to have solar cells in it. It needs to have wind turbines in it. And it needs to have many, many, many more than we currently have. I think we've got about 4% penetration, maybe even that 3% penetration of electric vehicles in our domestic car fleet at the moment. So just to solve that problem alone, and just in New Zealand, we need 50 times more lithium batteries, 50 times more neodymium magnets, 50 times more the amount of strengthened steel chassis. And this is a global problem. This is everywhere going on, everywhere, all at once. So New Zealand is not unique in this context. We are going to live through this change in metals consumption around the world, whether we like it or not. The question is not, is it going to happen? The question is, where is it going to happen, and how is New Zealand going to maintain its lifestyle? How are we going to maintain our economy? I went past the student protest out in the quad on the way in, which was quite interesting. It was about no jobs, no pay, we're gone. Yeah. If we have an economy where we don't have enough external revenue coming in, and our export revenue does not meet our imports, our wages will continue to go down and our young people will leave. I have 3 teenagers. I'd quite like them to grow up and have jobs in New Zealand. But at the moment, unless you can see new industries coming on and new made items, which is what actually makes wealth for a nation, that's not necessarily guaranteed. So we need to have a debate about how New Zealand uses its advantages, how it uses its resources, and we need to have it with a full understanding of the constraints that New Zealand is a special place and we want to protect it. But I think we need to be very careful about saying we can't do anything anywhere because it's just too hard, because that is not the world we live in. And we do need to make these changes in order to address these huge challenges that are in front of us.
Thank you. And I think to throw some praise in the direction of yourself and Morgan, it's some of the innovation around the technologies that we use and how we get to some of these metals we need to change the way we're doing it. And the work you do, I see as having immense value for that reason alone. Josie.
Thanks very much. I would like to thank Dr. Gold for inviting me, or whoever did invite me. It's been a very instructive day for me, and I would like to thank Aotearoa Nui for your very strong points well made. And for me personally, it was a very good opportunity to hear you. And I think I explained to you in the break where, you know, this is a young country and we are going through a lot of change, and we do need to be able to talk to each other. And so I very much valued listening to you. Thank you very much. I think the point has been made that the next big part of our world is data driven, and to be data driven we need energy, and we don't have that energy. In fact, we don't have enough energy in New Zealand to run manufacturing. It's probably why Fonterra's gone down to basics, because the cost of energy and the availability of energy in this country is a big problem. And it's a big problem for the work that Morgan and Chris are doing, because, and I've had this conversation with politicians, we should be adding value to these mineral products, but we can't, because you can't manufacture here because there's no energy. And so it goes round and round in circles. And we are all reliant on electricity. We're going to be even more reliant on electricity. My daughter lives in Melbourne. They've pulled out all the gas, and then they had a power cut, and it's freezing, and they had no electricity. So we kind of need to think these things through of how it's all going to work. And I actually sent my child to Australia and said, don't come back because there's nothing for you in this country. And because that's sort of what we're getting to, is it's so hard here to have these conversations, to get progress, to think about what's next. And I think they have a more, you live in Australia, I think they have a more optimistic view there. And I think it's a shame that we don't have that. So fully support, we've got to get people into the stream of the school of education. And I think someone said to me in the break that Otago want to do some critical minerals courses. That would be fantastic, because we've got to understand the potential. We've got to know the science. We've got to be able to have informed discussions. Critical minerals are not really even a thing in New Zealand yet, because we don't know how to do it. And so I don't think anyone needs to panic. It's not going to be a mine on every corner. As you know, it takes a long time, very expensive, and has been sidetracked by a lot of narrative that's not necessarily helpful to how the world progresses in a sane way that does care for the environment, that does care for people, but does allow us a high quality of living and jobs.
Right. Thank you. There we go. We've got, I've already seen some hands raised around the room. Shall we? Two questions from the audience, right? And then we need to wrap it up. Okay, so Fox is waving away.
Kia ora tātou. I teach art history. My question is, from everyone on the panel, whose responsibility is it to manage the environmental and social impacts?
So I will say we are fortunate to live in a country that has very high regulatory standards. So there is a regulatory framework that everybody has to work within, both for environmental and, quite importantly, in the minerals space, for worker rights, health and safety and things like that. There are parts of the world that don't do that very well. So there is a regulatory framework which then puts the responsibility on the companies to work within the regulatory framework. So it's part government to set the framework, and then it's all the companies working within that framework's responsibility to meet those requirements. And they do get punished and penalised and fined and if they don't.
Anyone else?
That's probably me that one.
Look, I think the prime responsibility is the company or the one that's winning whatever out of the ground. But to go to Mike's point, if we wish to generate imagination in this country and for people to think outside the square and not to continue to mine, we need to empower the population with policy and governmental direction that allows them to do that, not completely remove that from them. Currently, we have regulation that is actually taking away barriers to environmental damage. To create that damage, you only have to look at fast track legislation is designed to remove the voice of the people. It's as simple as that. We don't have good regulation here. I'm sorry, I disagree with you. We don't have that in this country. And we've seen it firsthand about how it can go wrong. The enforcement regime is next to useless in terms of just a circular round of you do something wrong, you then get a fine, you carry on, you do it wrong again, you get a fine again, you go around in that circle. This country is poor at that. It's got an impression that it's not, but the truth is that it is. We have one of the worst polluted rivers in the world, and that is just continuing. So if we're going to get the imagination, we need to empower the people to give the imagination, and we need structured policy change within governmental and legislative change.
Just quickly, yeah, I mean, we have the idea that we have too strong or we have strong regulation is just bizarre. Just look at Pike River for an example of the failure of regulation. And yeah, we have as you know, others have said, we have a freshwater disaster here because of the lack of regulation and enforcement. So yeah, just totally disagree with Joe there.
I wonder if we've got time for one more question. Sefton.
Sorry, very bluntly, government. We had a failure of imagination about 50 years ago where we shifted to a self-regulatory model where governments decided frameworks, and then most of the environmental and social impact studies were commissioned by the proponent, and most of the monitoring is self-monitoring. And that is a fundamental failure of the regime across all sectors. So I'm just going to be blunt and say the government.
Last question.
Thank you. I'm a research assistant at Robinson Research Institute, and my question to the panel is that where do we draw a line between the economic benefits we derive from mining and the environmental damages that are associated with it? Thank you.
I think that's almost the question of the day, isn't it? And
how do we go?
Chris, yeah.
Sarah, we could have talked about this in your PhD supervision meeting. I'm definitely going to pass this one back down the line. I reckon Sefton's got something to say about this in a minute. I think my first answer is don't give it to the economists. Don't try and put a price on environmental damage. Don't try and put prices on these things and then turn it into a dollar conversation, because that's a terrible idea. What we do need to do is to be very clear about what an economic benefit looks like and how that benefits the communities that are impacted by that activity. And to think about that at a scale that is relevant both regionally for the operation, but also nationally. Because I do come back to the fact that these big operations, if you have a large mine feeding a large industrial plant like Glenbrook, which is $1 billion operation. It employs about 1,500 people directly, another 1,000 people indirectly. And that one does have reasonably well measured multiplier effects that are somewhere between 3 and 5 in the local economy. So that's something like $5 billion going into South Auckland as a result of that operation. That pays a lot of PAYE. That's a lot of doctors. That's a lot of teachers. That's a lot of university lecturers, policemen, corrections. We need this in our economy. So we need to then think about that on the other side about, are we making sure that the communities that are being affected by this, the people who are actually seeing a negative impact on their lives because there's a mine on their back doorstep, there's dust or there's trucks going, are they also seeing a benefit as well as at the national scale? And this is where I come back to my point about royalties. And we do need to make sure that there is actual public funding flowing into public infrastructure in those areas so that people can turn around and say, we are benefiting from this activity. Seth.
Look, because you've been moderating, you've not been able to quote your own slides back at the audience. So I'll quote your own slides back at the audience, which is kind of right time, right place, right mind, or wrong time, wrong place, wrong mind. The point you made really strongly in your presentation is that, you know, we get one shot at this in terms of mining. It means once it's gone, it has to have been converted to a sustainable, renewable, other sources of enduring social and economic impact. And if you cannot do that, then somebody's going to get rich for 20 years, and then actually the overall asset base of that region is worse because you've taken something away. So the example I sometimes throw out of this, because I grew up in Dunedin, and an awful lot of that infrastructure in the late 19th century was funded by gold royalties, huge amount of it. And if you think I went through a university which continues to deliver significant social and economic and cultural benefit, not entirely from the gold mining industry, but significantly funded by the 19th century gold mining industry, and it is still delivering benefits today. But there are also going to be the wrong mines in the wrong place at the wrong time. And mining companies say, it has to be now, it has to be now. Well, actually, if we have uncertainty around the impacts, it doesn't have to be now. Let's wait until we've got enough public science to understand the impacts properly. And then let's come back, because it's still going to be there in 20 years' time. Like, it's still going to be there. But then there's that broader point, which is also, let's look at the other bits of the system we can squeeze, which is, you know, actually, we're looking to decarbonize the economy as we know it. And this is your point, Mike, around the failure of imagination. If you want to go and see some really depressing stats, the Department of Transport produces fleet vehicle stats that looks at kind of like the fuel efficiency of the New Zealand fleet, which basically hasn't budged forever, because we all think that driving double cab utes is a human right in New Zealand. Like, it's just dumb. It's really dumb. And so we can actually squeeze other bits of the system, which is to electrify, but not to the current level of demand, by changing some of the big impacts around in terms of climate emissions, which in the case of New Zealand is, one, agriculture. It's cows and cars in New Zealand. We've basically got a two-part profile in terms of emissions. So we've got to be a bit more inventive rather than just looking at the mine. We've also got to look at the end use as well.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm going to wrap up my part here, because I think Carolyn and Valentine want to say something to close it. I'd just like to thank all the panelists for participating here. I think the fact that there were a number of other hands coming up as well for questions shows that this is a conversation that is current, that we need to keep having. And I'd encourage you all to keep paying attention, keep getting involved in conversations about not just critical minerals, but about mining generally in New Zealand. And I've got to say, as somebody who's worked in mining in New Zealand universities since the last 17, 18 years, Shane Jones scares me, but I love the fact that we are now starting to talk, to have this kind of level of conversation. So thank you all very much. Thank you all very much. And I think a round of applause for the
We would ask our panelists to still stay here while I invite the head of school to say some thanks to our speakers and to the
Can you share the karakia while I say this? Can you do that? Thank you very much. We have actually some koha for you to thank you for your time and your participation in the panel. I'm actually blown away by the quality of the presentations and the discussion that we had in the panel. It actually just surpassed anything that I imagined would happen when we were planning the symposium. So I kind of had goosebumps at times. And I want to thank the audience for being so respectful and engaged and participatory as much as you could be in the whole discussion and the process. I hope that you came away or come away from this event with as much excitement for the topic and ideas for a future of New Zealand that is is imaginative, that is a future that we can work towards and is different and better. So again, thank you to everyone on the panel and to all of our speakers. A big round of applause. So the white boxes are vegan, for those of you who don't want animal products, and the black boxes of chocolates are not vegan. And as Valentine hands those out, we have our environmental studies senior lecturer, Amanda Thomas, will lead us in our closing karakia and mihi.
Kia ora hoa. Tēnei te mihi ki a koutou kua tai mai nei, I te rā nei, e mihi ana ki a koutou mo te kai reka, mo te kōrero reka. Kia Ngāti Roanui, tēnei te mihi ki a koutou mo te hautūtanga tonu. Tēnei te mihi ki a koutou, me karakia tātou. Ina hea te tapu nui, te tapu roa, te tapu hōhoro, ka whakairia ki runga kia tū tā rewa hui e tāi ki e. Tēnā koutou.
Thank you, Amanda.